Okay, so good morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cami Webb-Gannon. I'm a lecturer here at the University of Wollongong, and I'm the coordinator of the West Papua project. It's really wonderful to have all of you warming the seats in here this morning, and we have quite a few participants on Zoom as well. So thanks to all of you for coming out on a rainy morning to the University of Wollongong. Thanks to those of you from around the world who are joining in. Some of you at quite, in hours that most people would be sleeping in your part of the world. So just a couple of quick housekeeping items. Please make sure that you check in using the QR codes on the desk, and there's hand sanitizer out on the wall out there. Okay, and also please note that the views that the presenters air here today are the views of those individual presenters and do not necessarily reflect the views or policy positions of the University of Wollongong. Okay, so before I begin, I'd like to do something really important, and that is to read out an acknowledgement of country that was crafted by the Aboriginal Advisory Group and endorsed by the Indigenous staff and community at UOW. It goes like this. We acknowledge that country for Aboriginal peoples is an interconnected set of ancient and sophisticated relationships. The University of Wollongong spreads across many interrelated Aboriginal countries. Today we meet on the land of the Wadi Wadi people on Dharawal country. And these relationships are bound by this sacred landscape and the intimate relationships formed with and by that landscape since creation. From Sydney to the Southern Highlands to the South Coast, from freshwater to bitter water to salt, from city to suburban to rural, the University of Wollongong acknowledges the custodianship of the Aboriginal peoples of this place and space that has kept alive the relationships between all living things. We acknowledge the devastating impact of colonisation on our campus's footprint and commit ourselves to truth-telling, healing and education. Our world is racked by human rights crises at this point in time. The media has honed in on the war in Palestine, which today I've just read that there's been a ceasefire, so that's fantastic. The deadly coup in Myanmar, the crimes against humanity committed by China against its Uyghur population. What we're not hearing about, although equally dire, is the upsurge of violence against Indigenous West Papuans by the Indonesian state over the past few months. Indeed, Indonesia is steering attention away from the crisis in its own sphere by condemning Israel's military targeting of Palestine. 10 days ago, Indonesian President Joko Widodo urged the United Nations Security Council to take measures against Israel for repeated human rights violations. Well, we're here today to both launch the West Papua project at UOW and to support West Papuans' own call to the United Nations to put an end to the violence in their territory. We'll hear from speakers later on this morning about the Indonesian Army's failed counterinsurgency in the highlands of West Papua, supposedly intended to bring peace to the region, but instead resulting in tens of thousands of internal refugees. About the torture and killing with impunity of the 3 Bagal brothers, who had access to health clinic after one had been shot in the arm by the Indonesian Army. After accessing that clinic, they didn't make it out alive. About the dispatch of 400 of Indonesia's most ruthless soldiers, given the sobriquet Satan's forces, to West Papua in recent days. And about the arrest of West Papuan human rights and independence activist Victor Yemo, who was actually slated to speak at our forum today, but who was arrested and detained for exercising his political right to self-determination. He has been charged with treason and for organising the protests that swept across West Papua last year, and human rights observers hold grave concerns for his future and for his well-being in prison. These are some of the very concerning incidents of human rights violations taking place not more than 180 kilometres from Australia, and yet we're hearing very little about them in mainstream media. This is why we need institutions like the West Papua Project, to keep human rights issues that are close to home on the public agenda, to vet and verify stories and statistics that come from Indonesia and from West Papuans and organisations on the ground in West Papua, to publish analyses of the conflict that can be tabled at regional fora, such as the Melanesian Spearhead Group and the Pacific Islands Forum, groups which have the power to recognise and urge action on the crisis in West Papua, to educate the Australian public and to facilitate policy solutions to the protracted problems. In a few minutes, we'll hear from the project's convener, Jim Elmsley, who founded the project at Sydney Uni 20 years ago. But we've decided to bring the project from Sydney Uni, which acted as the project's host long after its personnel had left the institution, to the University of Wollongong, where I'm now based permanently. We have quite a few notable scholars here at the university with expertise on the West Papua conflict, including Emeritus Professor Ted Wolfers, who will speak to us later today, and Emeritus Professor Stephen Hill. We also have many others involved in valuable research in the Pacific region. We've got Maddie over here, who's doing a master's on ocean law in the Pacific. And we hope that by hosting the West Papua project here, we'll attract more students from the Pacific to the university and encourage existing UOW students to take up studies that focus on our near region.
Yeah.
And now I'd like to introduce our esteemed guest, whom we are honoured to have launch the West Papua project here today, the Lord Mayor of Wollongong, Gordon Bradbury. The Lord Mayor is renowned in our city for his commitment and action in relation to both social justice and political justice, two of the values that inform the West Papua project. We also invited him because he is an ordained minister of the Uniting Church, a church in Australia that has provided long-standing support to the struggle for peace with justice in West Papua. And I hand over to you now, Lord Mayor. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, that's great news. That's good.
Indeed, this is a project that's close to my heart, and your values and your concerns I share. But before I go any further, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land in which we meet, and also acknowledge their elders past, present, and those who are emerging within the Aboriginal community to remind us of the heritage that we have in this nation and the injustices that have occurred in the past as we endeavour in this nation to wrestle with our history and our understanding of our relationship with those who are the original custodians and owners of this wonderful country of ours, but at the same time aware of its injustices that have got us to this point. Well, what an interesting combination of events, in as much that we are now witnessing the impact of colonialism, and Palestine is one example where it's still unfolding since the activities or the deliberations after the First World War and things like the Balfour Declaration, and the attitudes, especially of America, in pushing their agenda in terms of taking over spaces and getting those who are sympathetic to their side of the argument in charge. And that's no least in Indonesia's case as well. In as much that we are aware that the Dutch, after the Second World War, ultimately relinquished their involvement in Indonesia, and more specifically in our case, in the circumstance West Papua, then becoming, after the Second World War, Irian Jaya. I'm very mindful of the impact and the issues that were generated because of things like the domino theory that were all dished up during the 60s. And that's what led America into Vietnam and all the strife that was associated with that tragic event. And then we witnessed moments like East Timor as well. And fortunately, my wife at the time went into East Timor around about year 2000 to do capacity building. And it was a great honour to be there on the great night of the declaration of the formation of Timor-Leste. So sitting in the dirt with the people as we celebrated that opportunity for freedom and self-determination. Mind you, the Portuguese couldn't even take their hands off it at that stage, and still having Portuguese as the #1 language in East Timor just reflects how insidious colonialism is. And the local language has been relegated to, sort of down the ranks there somewhere. But what I am very conscious of is that we're still looking at the impact of colonialism, and more specifically in Papua and New Guinea, right across the island, and recognising the fact that there were a group of people there who had a different way of approaching governance, their cultural traditions and so on, the Melanesian traditions and the various tribal groups. We're still looking at the struggle that's going on even in Papua New Guinea, on our little patch over on the eastern side, as that nation still struggles to form a nation state because it's an imposed system. And still the story goes on. And West Papua is not least caught up in this process as well. and utilised by the interests of the West. What I'm more concerned about is the fact that with the rise of China, we're in a very insidious situation of having to back Indonesia to be with us as we stand with Australia and others against the power of China and the rise of Chinese power in Southeast Asia as well. So we're going to be caught between a rock and a hard place in this respect, but that doesn't mean we sacrifice human rights in the process. And what I'm concerned about is that Indonesia is also a colonial power in its own way, a culturally colonial power. That is, that it's subduing the rights and the opportunities for the people of West Papua to express themselves and to live in that cultural freedom. It's another thing for it to be economically independent and so on. But, you know, let's explore the issues. Let's keep the issues alive. Let's keep the conversation going and also generate power, another voice, I should say, to inject into this situation. Otherwise, their needs and their aspirations will be submerged in the interests of mainly the Javanese. So today, it's my great honour to be here, but also as a Uniting Church minister, aware of the Christian missionaries that have gone into that part of the world. And Christian missionaries weren't always a good thing in terms of the influence and destruction of Indigenous culture, but at the same time, they did inject one thing, and that is with the enthusiasm for freedom and the rights of people to express themselves. There are diverse groups in the Christian missionary experience, and don't put me down there with all that mob that went in and said there was only one way to see God and to do things. Okay, so I'm not into that space, and you know, God didn't make the world in 7 days and knocked off, you know, and all that sort of nonsense. But the original, and can I say, the true Christian missionaries who took the true Christian message is the one that upholds people's rights for self-determination and their dignity and worth. And even though you mightn't agree with them in terms of their faith stance or whatever it may be, I'm very conscious of the fact that the ultimate is truth, freedom, and human dignity. It reminds me of a story that John Doyle related in an Andrew Olley lecture once, and I thought it was a classic in as much that he quoted somebody who observed a Christian burial up in the Highlands, and they were swinging the body over the grave, and it went in the name of the Father and of the Son and into the Holy Ghost. I love it. That's the way it should be. Everyone, thank you for taking up the cause and fighting on in the interests of the people of West Papua. The work isn't done. It's getting more and more intense in terms of protecting their freedoms and opportunities and respect for their great Melanesian culture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lord Mayor. I'm grateful for your words and your willingness to open this, but also for your deep knowledge of the region and, you know, awareness of East Timor and the conflict in West Papua and even colonialism in Papua New Guinea and the impact that that has had. So thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Jim Elmsley. He is a political economist. He's the founder of the West Papua Project when it started at Sydney Uni in 2000, a Pacific art dealer and author of path-breaking scholarship on the West Papua Project, on the West Papuan conflict. So Jim's going to give us a brief history of the project. Thanks, Jim.
Good morning, everybody. Nice to be here in Wollongong and at the university. I thought it might be useful to people to have an idea what the West Papua Project actually is. I did a PhD at Sydney University on the independence movement, and it was entitled Irian Jaya Under the Gun, Indonesian Economic Development versus West Papuan Nationalism. And as a theme, it's still very relevant today. I finished that in 1999, and I was working, my supervisor was Professor Peter King, and I was working through the course of my research with a lot of West Papuan activists like John Ondawami. So collectively, Peter King, John Ondawami, and myself decided to launch the West Papua Project, which at the time was just a temporary name, but it's stayed, with the view of the immediate ambitions were to, well, for me personally, to continue the connection and research into West Papua. For John Ondawami, it was to provide him a position to remain in Australia. The Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at Sydney University was run by Professor Stuart Rees, who was very supportive of the project. And we launched in 2000. Our patrons were Tim Flannery and Meredith Bergman, who was then president of the upper house in New South Wales Parliament. And we, you know, the broad theme, I guess, was to pursue peace with justice in West Papua, and to try and do it from an academic point of view, so that the information we produced and the views we produced were grounded, and in as much as we could do it on facts and footnotes, that it was not just opinion pieces. We had our first conference in early 2000, and that was at an International House, and it has sort of grown from there. The first convener was John Otto Ondawami, or coordinator, I should say. And in later years, John Wing took over. And then in, I think it was 2009, Tammy became involved in it and did her PhD at Sydney University. It was run an informal steering committee that involved a lot of different people, not just in Sydney, but around Australia and around the world. There's too many people here to acknowledge that have been involved in it over the years, but I will mention a few later. So the purpose and achievements, I guess, we had from 2000 as many conferences and workshops that involved at various times bringing people down from West Papua, very senior church leaders and independence activist leaders and other people. You can't not be involved with the church if you're in these issues, because the church, then the different church denominations are very active in trying to help the West Papuan people. They try to stay out of politics where possible, but it's almost impossible in a place like West Papua to not be involved in politics. We've had many conferences, not just in Sydney, but at Queensland University. And we've had meetings in the New South Wales Parliament, in the Victorian Parliament, and in the Federal Parliament in Canberra, which has been a venue at various times in launching the reports we've had. The last conference we had was in Sydney, which was called Beyond the Pacific, which was a very interesting conference because we combined it with the climate change elements. And our keynote speaker at that conference was Ralph Regenvanu, who is now the opposition leader in Vanuatu, and who's spoken recently about what's going on in West Papua. And the key event, I guess, we're talking about here is the designation by the Indonesian government of OPM fighters as terrorists, which is a very broad term and gives the government and the military a lot of power to detain people and carry on activity with very little scrutiny. And this conference we're having now has been talked about for nearly 2 years, but it was delayed all last year because of COVID. The West Papua Project also produced many significant reports, starting off with, well, one of them, Genocide in Papua, which was John Wing and Peter King, which got a lot of attention. We had Get Up, Stand Up in 2010. We had Blundering In, which was about the Lombok Treaty. We were called as witnesses, Peter King and myself, to give evidence to the J. Scott committee that went on to form that treaty. And research is still continuing in various aspects, including work such as by Julian King, who's associated with the project, onto the early transition of West Papua from being a UN trusteeship to its current political status. There have been many books published from this project by Stephen Hill, Tammy Webb-Gannon, Eben Kursky, Jason McLeod, Peter King, John Otoandawami have all published books with significant contribution to our knowledge of West Papua. In July 2013, we conducted the Biak Massacre Citizens Tribunal, which was really a groundbreaking event because we had eyewitnesses and survivors of the massacre of some several hundred people on Biak on July 6th, which had been basically submerged completely in history. And that was overseen by very significant legal figures like John Dowd, Nicholas Cowdery, and Keith Suter. We've also over the years engaged with many Indonesian people, researchers and activists and church people who are deeply concerned with what's going on in West Papua and has been going on for many years. And again, I won't name people, but I'm very pleased to see the continued involvement of Indonesian people who have the best interests of the West Papuan people at heart. So the idea of the West Papua project was to provide a space within academia that we can discuss these issues, that people can do their research and present it through an academic forum so that it can be quoted and used by various organisations, as Cam has mentioned. So I'll just wrap up quickly by acknowledging some of the people involved in this project who have died. The first being John Otoandawami, who was a great friend of mine and a kingpin in my own research, and Peter King, who without his presence, we wouldn't have got anywhere. And then also Indonesian researchers like Muridin Wijodo, who was at LIPI, who was significantly involved in the Papua Roadmap, which was a noble effort on the Indonesian part to try and resolve the conflicts. Mark Worth, another old friend of mine who was a filmmaker and journalist and deeply involved in West Papua. I'd also like to acknowledge Franz Albert Joku, who's not very popular with a lot of West Papuans, but we gave him space to air his views, which were strongly that West Papua should remain within Indonesia and its future was best served by doing so. And then there was also very significant West Papuan leaders like Clemens Wanaweri and Wim Zonganau, all of who moved on, but they're remembered very fondly and their contribution is acknowledged. And I would like to thank the University of Wollongong to provide this opportunity because I think it's very important that these issues are discussed and looked at and talked about without having any predetermined outcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim, for highlighting some of the kind of most significant achievements and moments of the project and paying tribute to some of the key players who are no longer with us but have done remarkable work. I'd like to also just acknowledge Rex Sumakiak, who is one of the most long-standing fighters for human rights and independence in West Papua. He's in Canberra. Because of his health, he wasn't able to be here today, but he usually would be at an event like this. Okay, now can I hand over to Mr. Ronnie Karenni. He is the newest member of the 3 convener coordinators of this project. Without him, the project would not have a future. So Ronnie is a phenomenal human rights campaigner, a wonderful musician, an author, and he's a special advisor to the West Papua project. I'd like you to invite you to say a few words, please, Ronnie. Thank you.
Thank you, Kemi. Thank you, Dr. Jim, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you as well for those who joined us online and here in person. Lord Mayor, thank you as well for your kind words as well. Basically, I would also like to acknowledge the custodians of this space that we all gathered here, and to say that we as First Nation Indigenous people continues to fight and to protect our land and the dignity of our people. And the role of West Papua Project today that we're relaunching is very significant and valuable to the cause that West Papuans have been fighting for and have been crying for over 5 or almost 6 decades. And the significance of it is where it comes to the status of the legality and the political status of West Papua is where we need an academic think tank such as West Papua Project to be able to provide that in-depth analytical perspectives and to provide that not only at forums, but to inform policymakers, informing those who are within the bigger circle at the UN spaces to look at this issue within those lenses of legal and the political status. I understand the time is also come to an end for this relaunch, but I just wanted to quote one of West Papua's musicologists, Anolap, when he was in prison in the 80s because of the power of music. They went around to collect songs and in different languages. And one of his last songs, while he was in prison in 84 and gonna be tortured, he wrote, "Hidupini suatu misteri." And these words is still echoed in many West Papuans today. When we hear about Kemi mentioning the arrest of the prominent civil resistance leader, Victor Yemo, it resonates with many of us. And I would like to just use that as an opportunity when we probably after cutting the ribbon, would like to reflect on that and to sing on that, because that's what many Papuans are feeling and going through every day. And this morning, I also would like to acknowledge that throughout West Papua, 6 a.m. this morning in Manokwari, activists have already occupied the spaces in Sorong, around parts of Indonesia, in Jogja, Bandung, Semarang, as well as here in Australia, down in Melbourne, there'll be action. And as far as the Pacific in Fiji, where there's this online chat with the Oblong Table, as well as University of South Pacific with human rights alumni students, all joined in this event together in support and also in solidarity with the people of West Papua. So it is also with a great honor, and thank you as well, and for everyone to come here. And we continue. It is a journey that the story that we need to keep it going and keep in the conversation within this academic space. Thank you.
Now I'd like to invite the Lord Mayor to cut the ribbon for the project, please. And we've got my father as the official photographer for the event.
And I noticed the government issues scissors. I should have brought the gold ones from the mirror, but never mind. This is a great honour indeed to launch the West Papua project here at the University of Wollongong. So therefore, I cut the ribbon. Well done. Thank you. Nice to meet you. And I'll leave you with your evaluation. I'm going to do there.
we have a musical item, which will be performed by Ronnie Karenni and Michael Webb. But before that, we have Dr. Emma Kluge, who has to go to another event. And so she is going, we're basically starting the conference part of today a little bit early before we finish the launch with the musical item. So we're going to hand over to Emma for 15 minutes to deliver her paper. Then we'll do the musical item, and then we'll get full on into the seminar for today. Thank you. Over to you, Emma.
And I'm sorry that I have to interrupt the launch part. I unfortunately have a work commitment, but hopefully I'll be back afterwards to maybe celebrate with you at the end. I just want to say a big thank you to Cami and to Ronnie for inviting me today. I unfortunately wasn't able to cross over with Cami at Sydney University, but she was still very involved in my PhD research and served on my supervisory panel. So it's always a pleasure to be involved in anything you do, Cami. My name is Emma Kluge. I recently completed my PhD at the University of Sydney, and I'm currently working as a research fellow, continuing to think about West Papua. I also want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional custodians of this land. And I also want to acknowledge the West Papuans joining us today and the ongoing struggle for independence for West Papua. As a non-West Papuan, I thank you for letting me share in your history and your struggle. So today I'm going to talk to you, thank you, about the research that I conducted during my PhD and that I hope to build on as I write my first book. As the slide says, my work focuses on the West Papuan Campaign for Independence at the United Nations across the 1960s. And it is so nice to be in a room where I don't first have to explain where West Papua is and what I mean when I say West Papua, which is very unusual for me. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history that I'm going to cover and that it's familiar to you, but hopefully I can maybe bring a new angle to the way we think about the 1960s. So during the 1950s, West Papua was under Dutch colonial control. And after the loss of its Indonesian empire, the Dutch turned their focus to the territory and began to facilitate a process of decolonization to make West Papua an independent territory. West Papuan leaders took up this opportunity to launch their own campaign for independence in the 1960s. This process was then interrupted by Indonesia, who claimed the territory belonged within its republic. And in 1962, they leveraged Cold War politics to gain US support and then forced the UN into negotiations, which resulted in the territory being transferred to Indonesian control. West Papua was finally incorporated into the Indonesian Republic in 1969 after the so-called Act of Free Choice. And while this vote was meant to allow for West Papuans to choose whether or not to remain part of Indonesia, the representatives were hand-selected by the Indonesian government, and the process was tightly controlled so that only one outcome was allowed: the incorporation of West Papua into the Indonesian Republic. The sovereignty of the territory is still contested to this day, and with many activists arguing that the West Papuan people should have the right to an internationally supervised referendum, where, unlike in the Act of Free Choice, the people are actually given the chance to vote on the future of the territory. So when West Papuan history in the 1960s are referenced, usually three moments are highlighted. So the 1961 flag raising ceremonies in December, the New York Agreement that was signed between the Netherlands and Indonesia in August of 1962, and the 1969 Act of Free Choice, which moments that I just highlighted in my overview. And arguments are usually mobilized about the legitimacy of these events and the agreements and their comparative significance to the ongoing conflict. However, there is a risk that these moments can erase all that occurs in between them, and that the history of the 1960s is interpreted only through the lens of trying to argue against the agreement and against the legitimacy of the Act of Free Choice. This framing also sets up the New York Agreement as something that supersedes West Papuan sovereignty and as the arbiter of West Papuan rights. And in doing so, it further legitimizes UN or Indonesian control. A focus on these moments often tends to marginalize West Papuan voices. While West Papuans were the instigators of the flag raising ceremonies, they were marginalized at both the signing of the New York Agreement and during the voting of the Act of Free Choice. So therefore, focusing on these moments can lead us to narrate West Papuan history from the perspective of foreign diplomats and policymakers. So the driving question of my thesis was, what would it look like to study the 1960s through the lens of the West Papuan people? Rather than assessing the legitimacy of Indonesia's control, the New York Agreement, or the Act of Free Choice, I wanted to focus on the development of the West Papuan Campaign for Independence, how a small nationalist movement was transformed into a transnational campaign for independence. I wanted to get a sense of how West Papuans would narrate this history, or at least how this history might differ if West Papuans were the central protagonists in the narrative. How did activists frame their struggle? What were the strategies of their campaign? Additionally, I wanted to connect the West Papuan campaign up with the broader international context of anti-colonialism and the Black International to show the ways in which these campaigns intersected with broader campaigns against colonialism and racism. So while my focus is on this history, I want to explain quickly how I came to study this approach and what it looks like to construct this kind of history, which hopefully can help other activists and scholars who are seeking to work in this field or engage with this history. So the reason I'm so interested in the West Papuan Campaign for Independence is perhaps because I was introduced to West Papua in a rather unusual way. Instead of learning about the West Papuan struggle here, West Papuan campaign in a politics course, I was introduced to the struggle here in the reading room of the National Archives of Australia in Canberra in 2015. In studying Australia's refugee history, I came across a mention of West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea during the 1960s, which led me to a collection of case files in the National Archives. As I followed the stories of these West Papuan refugees in the archives, I was introduced to the West Papuan Campaign for Independence. In the applications for permissive residence in Papua New Guinea, West Papuan refugees were given the opportunity to make a personal statement that would be included in their application. One of the personal statements I first read was this one from Daniel Kadam, who sought refuge in Papua New Guinea in 1969. And he says, "I decided to withdraw with my family to the territory of Papua New Guinea. Reasons: all political figures and organizations have had consultations to ask the Indonesian government to guarantee freedom of political action, party activity, and assembly. But after this was leaked, there were wild arrests, killings, shootings put into action by the Indonesian armed forces, suffering in and out of prison, and property looted and stolen by the Indonesian army. For me personally and comrades in arms, 30,000 West Papuans, ordinary people, have been the casualties. 1963 until 1969 has become a matter for us all." Kadam's statement and his file recorded his experiences in West Papua. He was imprisoned by the Indonesian military and sought refuge because he feared Indonesian retaliation as a result of his involvement with the West Papuan resistance movement, the OPM. Reading the personal statements of West Papuans like Kadam, I was brought into their struggle for independence. As the West Papuans described their suffering under Indonesian colonialism and their desires for the future of West Papua, I became invested in this story and their struggle. Their words radicalized me and changed the direction of my life. After my honours year, I wanted to know more about West Papua, so I decided to continue on to do a PhD so I could dig deeper into the history of the West Papuan Independence Campaign. I was particularly interested in their campaign to the United Nations, since this was an ongoing strategy of West Papuan activists. Yet I was frustrated with how academic histories of West Papua in the 1960s tended to sideline West Papuan voices. West Papuan actors were there, but they were often the objects of debate rather than the subjects. So often West Papuans were referenced only in relation to the Netherlands or Indonesia, or the resistance movement was used as background detail to the challenges faced by the UN mission and the diplomats negotiating the conflict. I knew that West Papuans campaigned at the United Nations during this time, so I went searching for more direct access to their campaign through the UN archives in New York, which were mentioned in John Salford's book. To my surprise, I found files literally labeled petitions, which contained hundreds of letters written by West Papuans during the 1960s. These files were in the footnotes of other accounts, but only mentioned in passing. Few historians ever quoted from them or took the time to really dig into their meaning. In these petitions, a whole world of West Papuan ideas and political thinking opened up to me, ideas that both fleshed out and challenged dominant historical narratives about West Papua in the 1960s. Yet using UN archives came with its own challenges and raised many questions for me methodologically. What did it mean to study the West Papuan campaign for independence using the archives of the United Nations? How would this influence the story that was told and the perspectives that were represented? The UN archives are almost overwhelming in their detail about West Papua in the 1960s. The issue of the future of West Papua was often debated at the UN General Assembly. The New York Agreement was negotiated by the UN, and under the New York Agreement, the United Nations was required to both administer the territory for a short period under the United Nations Temporary Executive Authority between 1962 and 3, and then return to observe the Act of Free Choice between 1968 to 1969. There were pages and pages of reports from UN representatives who went to West Papua over the years. The UN archives provided a compelling counter-narrative to the one I had set out to write, drawing me into the logic of the UN and along a path that was well-trodden and well-established by other scholars, assessing the significance of the UN and the validity of the New York Agreement in the Act of Free Choice in determining the future of West Papua. If you were to go through all the previous drafts of my thesis, you would see copies where I got sidetracked by these archives, long passages on the debates between Indonesia and the Netherlands, pages dissecting the effectiveness of the UN administration, and long expositions of the UN's role in overseeing Indonesia's miscarriage of justice in the lead up to the Act of Free Choice. Yet this was not the history that I was trying to follow and not how I wanted to contextualize the petitions of the West Papuans. So to resist this logic, I drew deeper into the experiences of West Papuan individuals and communities. So in order to study the West Papuan campaign to the United Nations from a West Papuan perspective, I needed to reconstitute a West Papuan archive. I collected these archives by following the lives of West Papuans to Papua New Guinea, the Netherlands, and the United Nations in New York. Here, I returned to the case files of West Papuan refugees in Papua New Guinea. I conducted oral history interviews with the descendants of West Papuan activists in Papua New Guinea and the Netherlands, and I have to have a big thank you to Cami for connecting me up with those networks, and sought out sources written by West Papuans and collected quotes of West Papuans that were scattered across other scholarly accounts. This journey took me all around the world and was only facilitated by the privileged access to resources that I enjoyed as an Australian scholar at a well-funded university. Getting to know different communities of West Papuan activists was particularly important to me to help understand the significance of this period and how to frame the West Papuan campaign in the 1960s. I was lucky to get to conduct interviews with some of the descendants of those whose petitions were found in the UN archives in the 1960s. Through these interviews, I got a sense of the lives of West Papuan activists, their motivations, and also their ongoing legacies. So what does this West Papuan archive tell us about the West Papuan campaign for independence in the 1960s? So probably no surprise to anyone in this room, but while the West Papuan campaign for independence was conducted at the UN by activists all around the world, particularly by a lot of activists in exile, it was formed out of the West Papuan and the early versions of the West Papuan nationalist movement, which had begun to form in the territory in the 1950s and early 1960s. Leaders involved in the West Papuan nationalist campaign in the early 1960s, those involved in flag raising ceremonies and going to the UN, then became the West Papuan activist leaders in exile. The platform they expressed in 1961 was then developed and transformed into an international campaign after the signing of the New York Agreement in 1962. And after 1962, the movement was fractured primarily across West Papua, Papua New Guinea, and the Netherlands, and a community later formed in Australia. Meaning West Papuan activists had to develop transnational networks to continue their campaign, which was no easy feat in the 1960s. There was a surprising amount of synergy between these locations, despite the challenges they faced as a result of Indonesian persecution in the territory and Australian obstructionism in Papua New Guinea. So the key strategies of the West Papuan campaign were record keeping, awareness raising, and petitioning. They linked their struggle with the rights discourse of the United Nations appealing both to the New York Agreement as well as the UN Charter and the 1960 Decolonization Declaration. Yet they combined this with the language of race. They appealed to African leaders as their brothers and sisters, and using the idea of a shared racial identity, while also claiming a unique right to land on the basis of indigeneity or ethnic cultural identity. The strategies of the West Papuan Transnational Network changed over the 1960s in response to events that were happening in the territory. After Indonesia left the UN in January 1965, the movement was particularly focused on record keeping and reporting information to the UN since they were no longer present in the territory. Once Indonesia rejoined the UN in 1966 and announced that it was going to conduct an act of self-determination, the campaign then switched to addressing issues in the territory and changes that would be needed to prepare for the act. When the United Nations returned to West Papua to oversee preparations for the Act of Free Choice, both local and diasporic activists intensified their campaign. So diasporic activists, so I'm speaking mainly of those in the Netherlands and some Papua New Guinea, appealed to UN delegates and those based in New York, while local activists delivered petitions to the UN offices in West Papua, and some of those managed to deliver petitions in Jakarta as well. Those in Papua New Guinea often ferried information between the two groups. It's hard to construct some of the underground networks, but it's very clear from different information that's being passed around that there is kind of this international circulation happening during this time. And during the voting process, West Papuan activists staged demonstrations and uprising in the territory to disrupt Indonesia's narratives about a lack of political engagement and to get the attention of foreign observers. So I don't have enough time to go into this campaign. And you can, I'm hopefully I can talk to some of you later and you can look at my other work. But I can tell you that while the West Papuans were unable to win out against Indonesia at the UN, the West Papuans garnered considerable support for their cause, especially from African leaders, and shifted the discussion around the right to self-determination at the UN, causing divisions amongst the anti-colonial and Afro-Asian bloc, which was kind of unthinkable in 1962 when the agreement was first signed. So yeah, this is a very quick recap of their strategies. And so if you're interested in learning more, I've written articles and I'm more than happy to share my PhD thesis with anyone. And also more than happy to share any of the files that I've come across that you might be interested in. So yeah, please email me, look me up on Twitter. And yeah, thank you for having me this morning.
All right, thanks so much, Emma, for that. I'd like to invite Ronnie Karenni back to the front and Michael Webb, who are going to perform a song about West Papua freedom.
So as I mentioned earlier about the realities that the Papuans are experiencing and going through, this song, Hidup Ini Suatu Misteri, written, composed by Laitano Lau, which means life is full of mystery. So it will be sung in Bahasa in the first verse, the chorus in English, what I dream for, what I wait for. There's nothing else, only freedom. So you guys can join in the chorus. What I dream for. It goes, what I dream for, what I wait for. There's nothing else, only freedom. Just imagine them, how many go. Soaring above and searching below. But what a pity unlucky fate. Only to be hunted by the hunter and killed. What I dream for is what I wait for. There's nothing else, only freedom. Take it away, Michael. What I dream for is what I wait for. There's nothing else, only freedom. What I dream for is what I wait for. There's nothing else, only freedom. There's nothing else, only freedom. Thank you.
So now I'll hand over the chairing of the conference or the seminar that we're starting today to Ronnie Karenni, who's going to be our timekeeper and introduce the speakers for the rest of the day. Thanks, Ronnie. Leonie, are you ready?
Yes.
Here she is.
I think I am.
Oh, it's okay. That's okay. All right. Just bear with me. I'll just make sure we're ready. So we're gonna begin with our seminar, and it's a great honor again to be able to chair this and to hear from different perspectives and research that are being done by various researchers and also those who have followed this West Papua case for a very long time, and also will be interested to do research on West Papua. So for now, I will introduce our first speaker, Leonie Tangahma, joining us all the way from the Netherlands. And Leonie is a member of the West Papuan community in the Netherlands, a community of about 1,500 Papuans who fled West Papua mostly because of their lives were in danger. And majority of the community continues to fight against the Indonesian oppression from abroad. Leonie also is the daughter of the late Bernard Tangahma, Minister of the Foreign Affairs in exile of the Republic of West Papua, which was unilaterally proclaimed by the Free Papua Movement, or OPM, on the 1st of July, 1971. Over the years, Leonie has been engaged with the local human rights NGO ELSEM in Europe, for which she provided, among other things, the regular representation of Papuan case at the UN forum, such as the Working Group on Indigenous Populations and the Commission on Human Rights, or now Human Rights Council. And in July 2011, Papua Peace Network organized a conference to make Papua's land of peace, and she was elected along with 4 other Papuans living in exile as a negotiator in the event that the Indonesian government implements its apparent willingness to hold a dialogue with Papuans at the time. So in today's seminar, she speaks on behalf of the Free Papua Movement, the OPM. The floor is yours, Kaka Leonie.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm going to try to share my screen. Let me see if I can do this. Is it visible? There should be a bird.
Yes, we can see you.
Thank you. So allow me for now, in full humility, to pay respect and tribute, although I'm not there physically, to the traditional custodians of Wollongong, the Darawal people, and to extend our revolutionary greetings on behalf of Lieutenant General Jeffrey Bomanak, who is the chairman of the Organisasi Papua Merdeka, on behalf of the leadership of the National Liberation Army of West Papua, the TPNPB, and on behalf of the courageous people of West Papua. I take this opportunity to warmly thank and congratulate our brothers and sisters from the West Papua Project at the University of Wollongong, and to all the speakers who are here today. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to share our perspective on human rights and the United Nations. Thank you for giving the opportunity to the Free Papua Movement to present its perspective. So for those of you who don't know that the Organisasi Papua Merdeka, Free Papua Movement, is the national liberation organization of the people of West Papua, which originated in the 60s to fight against the illegal Indonesian occupation of West Papua. The OPM recognizes the historic proclamation made on the 1st of July 1971 in Markas Victoria, liberated territory, as the rejection of the 1969 fraudulent act of no choice. And we uphold this proclamation as the expression of the continuous struggle of the people of West Papua. The OPM operates under the 1st of July 1971 Constitution and the OPM Charter of 1977. The OPM struggles for the unconditional recognition and respect of the right for self-determination and statehood of the people of West Papua, as guaranteed by the Charter of the United Nations and all relevant United Nations resolutions. The OPM has 3 wings: a political wing, a military wing, and a diplomatic wing. Today, in terms of human rights, I'd like to talk about how the OPM was able to report on human rights during the 70s and the 80s. In the 70s and the 80s, the OPM compiled reports and international, and so that they could submit them to countries and international institutions, such as the United Nations, but also groups such as the Non-Aligned Movement, the Organization of African Union. Information was gathered painstakingly, but the information was also confirmed by sources so that it would stand the test of truth. There were witnesses at the time, priests, mostly, who were still in the country in West Papua, and they would write home about it, and they would also attempt to reach the media. It was information that was precious, and when foreign dignitaries saw it, they were appalled. One of the pictures that struck me when I was a child was seeing a picture of a young boy in such a report. In that report that was compiled by the OPM, I saw this picture and the caption read, "The Indonesian colonial rulers airlifted thousands of pigs carrying a strange, rapidly killing disease to the densely populated central highlands of West Papua New Guinea. According to Amsterdam's newspaper, the Telegraaf, dated 20 May 1978, victims of the killer disease go mad suddenly, are struck blind, die suddenly, and have muscles paralyzed. The young child in the photo was paralyzed during his sleep, causing his leg to fall into the fireplace and to be burned. He lost his leg as a consequence, like so many others have. So all in all, the Indonesians had used worm-infected pigs to introduce this disease in the 70s as a form of biological warfare. Some physicians who were writing about this at the time admitted that the transmission to the May people from Paniai was restricted to a single importation of one batch of infected pigs from Bali in 1971. And from there on, the disease spread. Between 1973 and 1976, there were 157 patients with severe burns admitted to the hospital. 3/4 of the patients were classified as having 3rd and 4th degree burns, and 17 underwent amputations. Epileptic seizures were present in 64 males and 27 females. Most of the patients were unconscious at the time of accidentally burning in the household fire. So that was one of the cases that struck me. And in the 80s, the OPM was able to continue reporting. One of the venues was the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations. This is just the first page of one of the statements that were made at the time. And there too, all the atrocities were reported: operations, military operations, Operasi Tumpas, Sadar, Operasi Wibawa, Operasi Sapu Bersih, all kinds of operations that had as goal the annihilation of the people of West Papua. And then in the 90s, and this is a buildup, something happened. The West Papuan civil society was ready to take over this cumbersome task. The responsibility was starting to become theirs. At first, it was the churches and the church-backed reports that went out. You had, at the time, I think there was the Pat Walsh report and then the Muninghoff report, all detailing atrocities in the surroundings of Freeport. The first reaction of the Indonesian government at the time was complete denial. I believe they said that it was the work of an overactive imagination, but our people and our human rights activists stood their grounds, and organizations started coming out, activists, and organizations such as ELSAM, and that's the symbol of ELSAM, I think many of you will have recognized it, they started feeling strong enough to issue their own reports. And they reached out to their brothers and sisters in the diaspora, and we were happy to help. So I think also many of you will have recognized the famous human rights activist, our hero, John Rumbeck. And we were happy to help when they asked us to help. So we attended sessions of the United Nations Working Group on Indigenous Populations, the UN Commission on Human Rights, which is now the Human Rights Council. And we learned about the United Nations, and we learned that they were charter-based bodies, that they were treaty-based bodies. We learned all kinds of things. We specialized in it. We learned about special procedures. We learned about special rapporteurs. And here's another one of our heroes who led us throughout the UN, who said at some stage, "I dream not of the UN, I work there." He spoke of the Decolonization Committee of the UN, which has a list with 17 regions eligible for independence. And then there was a hopeful cheer from the audience. West Papua is not on that list, and then everybody groans, but the outcome of our struggle does not depend on the UN list. And that is one of the things that I want to carry today as a message. When we went to the UN, we learned that the United Nations was made up of two different entities. On the one hand, you have the actual UN with its member states, a purely political body which talks of human rights, but which doesn't really mean it very often. And on the other hand, you have the civil sovereigns, the Secretariat, those women and those men who do their best to make things happen. They have limited space of maneuver because of the politics, but they still want to make it happen, provided you keep quiet about it. So that's one of the things that we learned. You have to not over politicize things. And it was great that the civil society at that stage started to come out and as a neutral body that could report on human rights situation, on the human rights situation in West Papua. So it was very important that you do not use human rights to gain popularity in the public arena or in social media today. It's just a no-no. You shouldn't use UN officials to run your own personal campaign, make pictures, get popularity. So it's two things. It can backfire, and you're basically stopping that UN official or UN civil sovereign to help your cause further. So the main thing here is that it is necessary for us to make sure we work effectively, submitting reports always, and try to not over politicize things, because that's what we as political organization will do. This is a slide that I had prepared a while ago in 2016, 2017, when we had sort of looked at the top, you see the charter-based bodies, shows the General Assembly, where you had speeches, oral statements being held. And then at the bottom, you have the treaty-based bodies. So it's just an example of what we had. And so it's one of the things that the civil society in West Papua has started to specialize itself in, and something that we are very proud of. Because they have come a long way. This was also part of a slide I had prepared a while ago at the UPR, which is a process which is starting again this year up to next year in May 2022, when we're going to have Indonesia reporting at the Human Rights Council again. So as a conclusion, I'd like to say that the OPM used to have to report on human rights in the 70s and 80s because there was nobody else to do it. But then civil society came and took the lead. West Papuan civil society is basically the ones I would like to pay tribute to today. They are the ones that are fighting very hard without guns. They are the ones that we should all be supporting, albeit quietly, or without over politicizing things so that things can go wrong. So their credibility in front of the United Nations body that they lobby depends a great deal on how we support them. We can expect that reports might go wrong sometimes because of the conditions on the ground, but they're doing their best, and the OPM supports that. So that was basically my message today. Help them, help our civil society, help our human rights NGOs, our customary council, our JDP, our church organization, our media, our human rights activists, help them to protect our people, the people in Puncak Jaya, in Duga. So that was my message. And yes, thank you. That's just a picture of us in Geneva after a long day of lobbying. Thank you very much.
And thank you. Technology, so thank you for giving a perspective and also a bit of that historical context. Just stay with us online, and there'll be questions coming up. If anyone have questions, please drop it for our online participants. You can drop any questions in the chat box, and we will have a look at that and when it comes to the Q&A, we will respond to that. And also, yeah, towards the next session. But now I would like to take this opportunity. Firstly, I have to apologize on behalf of the chairman of the ULMWP, Benny Wenda, who couldn't be or wouldn't be able to present. However, we have ORIDEC Hub. ORIDEC is the ULMWP European Union mission and has been working within the European bloc in enhancing the self-determination and diplomatic work around that. And also, ORIDEC is the son of Leighton Olap and the song that we sang as well, that Mystery of Life. So it's good to put that as well in the context. So for now, I'm gonna invite ORIDEC up to give a ULMWP perspective.
Wah, Napi Roni, terima kasih banyak. Bisa dengar kah? Bisa dengar? Can you guys hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Hello? Halo? Bisa dengar? Bisa kah? Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Wah. Josuba buat semua. Terima kasih banyak teman-teman semua di Australia dan di seluruh dunia. Lewat kesempatan ini saya ingin terima kasih banyak buat ada Kemi dan Emma juga buat presentasi tadi. I would like to thank Emmy and Kemi for the presentation, all the hard work, and also a special thank to Napi Roni and Brother Michael for singing my father's last song. And can you guys hear me? Yeah, bisa. Okay, thanks, Kak Leni. Okay, because I can't hear myself, so that's the thing. But okay, terima kasih banyak. Terima kasih banyak Napi Roni, kamu tadi menyanyi beberapa lagu. You guys sing my father's last song, and it's always a difficult song to sing, but it's somehow it's different when our friends, our people sing the song. So terima kasih banyak. It means that his spirit is very much alive in all of us. Minta maaf. I was asked to give UMWP's perspective. But maybe, you know, after listening to Kaka Leonie's presentation, I think we need to, you know, actually we don't. There's not so much difference between all of us, because actually there's no difference between UMWP and OPM, because we have the same ancestors, we have the same elders. So when I look at this, you know, the agenda, I was pretty much surprised, because there's actually, you know, we have the same perspective actually, because all of us, we want Papua Merdeka. Papua Merdeka itu satu. We have only one goal. We all want to be free. We all want to be free from all the oppression from the colonial rule of Indonesia or the rest of the world. So actually, there is no difference between the UMWP and the OPM. And this is something actually we need to talk internally, but when you want to know what our perspective is, we want to be free, and you know, most of the time, campaign is about right to self-determination. Our campaign is about right to self-determination. But at the end, when Papua is free, kalau Papua merdeka, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Jadi when we are on the way to Papua merdeka, how many countries are we going to convince to support us? You know, we have to start with our own community in West Papua. Secondly, Melanesia. Thirdly, Pacific. And of course, Africa. We don't have to wait for Europe or the Western world, you know, because they will wait for us. They will wait when Melanesia Pacific is ready to help us. You know, this is the thing, this is the reality. This is what our African brothers said to us. Europe will never help us. They will not help us. We have to help ourselves. So this is our perspective. When we want to be free, we have to free ourselves in West Papua, in Melanesia, in Pacific, Africa, and the rest will join. The rest of the world will join. And I think the world is not ready for this coming, because actually West Papua is maybe our solution, you know, the Wakanda. West Papua is going to be the solution of the climate crisis. You know, when we talk about racism, when we talk about ecocide, when we talk about colonialism, everything is in West Papua. So when our brothers in Australia or in the United States or in Europe, they need to learn that actually all the thing that the Western world is looking for is actually already in West Papua. You know, we are trying to build a free nation where there is a balance between man and nature. So this is something like to share with the rest of the world, but somehow people doesn't understand a UN mechanism, or you know, and we don't have a future. We will, you know, we will be extinct when we do nothing about the situation right now. They will write about our history. There used to be a black people, a Melanesian people living in West Papua, living on that island above Australia. You know, so that's the message. My father was always singing about it. My father wrote songs about our way of life. And this is something we want to share with the rest of the world. Our vision, our green vision, where there is a balance between race, there's a balance between man and nature, there's a balance between rich and poor. This is something we want to share with the rest of the world, but somehow all this mechanism is making it so complex for us to explain our our perspective, our vision. But actually, all we want is to be free. All we want is to be free to go to a garden or go to fish and go to eat with a family without being threatened, you know, to be killed by Indonesia or whoever. But that's the reality. We talk about Victor Yemo, but there's a lot of people, you know, I saw a lot of our freedom fighters just sitting on the mountains, you know, waiting for the army to come. There are more than 20,000 Indonesian soldiers over there in West Papua. And people expect us to stay calm and stay quiet. I don't know whether this is part of our perspective. I don't know, but you know, when we sit down on the mountain and we look to our country, we see a lot of things. We have great hopes and desires, but somehow the world doesn't understand us. And thank you, Kakaleoni, what you said last time about Sister Veronica and Brother Surya. Orang Indonesia, the Indonesian brothers and sisters, they are carrying a cross. And this is something, it's not only Indonesian people, but also some friends in Australia, but the rest of the world. Many people are carrying a cross because in the past, when OPM started the struggle, when they killed my father was a member of the provisional government. When they killed him, we weren't prepared. We weren't prepared to declare things. We weren't prepared to engage talks with states. Oh, bagaimana? 3 menit. Oh, minta terima kasih Nabi. Wah. Jadi begitu. I think perspective. There's no future for West Papua inside Indonesia. We don't have any time to lose. We don't need to talk about special autonomy. We don't need to talk about extra special autonomy. No, we already refused it since the beginning, since 2001. So our perspective is we want to be free, Papua merdeka, merdeka penuh, and by all means necessary. By all means necessary. Saya harap semua bisa mengerti itu. Tapi yang penting itu teman-teman harus you guys need to know that, need to understand that the world is very worried about the situation in Israel, in Palestine, but nobody seems to care about what is happening in West Papua. So this is our reality. This is our reality. And this is something, yeah. You know, it's saddened because I'm a Christian, but they think automatically we should support Israel, but oppression is oppression and suffering is suffering. Destruction is destruction, death is death. And this is happening in West Papua since 1963. So our perspective is the solution is not only in the UN, it should begin in West Papua, Melanesia, Pacific, Africa, and the rest of the world. It will come, it is already beginning because actually it started in UK and the Dutch is also starting to awakening, starting to take some responsibilities. So we have great hopes in Europe, but it should start in Australia, in the Pacific, in New Zealand, before it comes to Europe and the rest of the world. So thank you very much. Terima kasih banyak. Hormat. Wah.
Thank you, Rideka, for giving that personal perspective. And just to add on a little bit there in terms of the perspective on ULMWP since its formation in 2014, it's to unify the movement within the diplomatic and political space. And it has garnered a lot of support since its formation. We have seen countries coming on board, especially with Vanuatu government, and that is in the history. And in 2019, we see that at the Pacific Island Forum, whereby the Pacific Island leaders made a strong commitment to call on the visit of the UN Human Rights Commissioner. And that is a successful story of the collective campaign by West Papuans in diaspora or outside, but also those who are inside, keeping the fire burning. So that's in a summary that I wanted to just conclude with that. And it is also a timely, as well with speaking of the Pacific Island Forum, and the text that came out of that is one that is strong to date. And also looking at the legal issue of West Papua is someone I would like to introduce, the next speaker, Siobhan McDonald. And Siobhan is a legal anthropologist with over 20 years of experience working with Indigenous people in Australia and the Pacific on land use, gender, and climate change. And she is a senior lecturer at Crawford School of Public Policy and the lead negotiator on climate change for the Vanuatu government. And it is an honor to introduce Siobhan and to give the perspective and your engagement with you were instrumental in the lead up to the Pacific Island Forum in 2019 and also beyond, moving forward from 2019 to date as well. So welcome, Siobhan.
Thanks, Ronnie. Thank you so much. So I'm going to just start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal Ngambri people on whose land I live and work. And I'm based here at the Australian National University. So I'm going to share my screen today and just take you through some of the kind of legal, political issues that I work on in the role that I play helping to do legal political work for the ULMWP. So I'm hoping you can all see that screen. So what I really want to do is take you through a discussion today of some of the legal political issues that are really at the edge of the work that we've been doing broadly across the Pacific region and internationally. And I think this really dovetails with some of what Leonie was talking about earlier from an OPM perspective. And what I'm trying to do here is really talk about the gulf that Leonie was referring to between what is expressed in international human rights declarations and how then it's possible for the Indigenous leadership and for the West Papuan leadership to mobilise some of those rights. So we within, the leadership is constantly working to articulate a set of rights to move these issues forward. All of us are concerned about the, the critical issues of human rights in West Papua. But sometimes there are not the political pathways that we would hope to move on issues around self-determination, for example. So as much as we would like to move forward on some of those political pathways, finding ways of mobilising pathways can be more difficult in some directions than others. And so there's a pragmatic space that we have to operate in terms of building coalitions and building sets of interests and moving forward. And so I'm going to touch on some of those issues today. So there is a recognition in international human rights law, and this has been for a long period of time, around the rights of self-determination. Articles 1 and 55 of the UN Charter recognise the principles of equal rights and self-determination of all peoples. The UN General Assembly in 1960 has a declaration on the grants of independence to colonial countries and peoples. There's a specific resolution. All of that was in play. All of that was in play at the time that West Papua began declaring the desire for independence. All of that predated, for example, the work that Emma Klug was starting to talk to us about earlier today. The UN General Assembly issued a 1970 declaration on the principles in international law recognising these aspects of self-determination. Both the ICCPR and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights recognise the rights to self-determination. And the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, Article 3, also recognises as a principal right the rights to self-determination for Indigenous people. So there is this enormous growing body of law that recognises a right to self-determination. How you give effect to that rights, how you build those coalitions through United Nations processes is something that's quite different. That's actually a political rather than a legal set of issues. So the work that I do, along with a lot of the people that we've been meeting with today as part of this West Papua project, so alongside Ronnie, alongside a huge body of the leadership, is work that takes part across the Pacific region. So I'm obviously located in Canberra alongside Ronnie, alongside Rex Rumbiak, but our work takes us particularly through Vanuatu, through that body of work into Fiji. It's regional work that takes us through the Pacific. And the work that I really focus on, so this is the work that I did alongside the delegation to the Pacific Island Forum. That delegation that I was located in was led by Ralph Regenvanu as the Foreign Minister of Vanuatu. But you can see as part of the delegation there, this is the ULMWP delegation as well. So there's Benny Wender, Laura Linney, there's Ronnie down the back, but there's a whole set of ULMP and Vanuatu representation. And the role that I play in this is really is a legal advisory role. So within these processes, there comes a point in time where you need legal technical drafting support. So this is a very technical process. The leadership obviously is engaged in issuing decision-making, and then that decision-making goes into a technical side drafting process where drafters from various states meet against other drafters and go into a technical drafting space that really meets often all night and all day to draft against each other. So this is, for me, this was many hours of drafting against the Australian delegation. And what happened really was that what we are trying to mobilise in this particular set of regional forums is a set of commitments around recognition of the really critical human rights issues that are occurring in West Papua. And so what we walked out of in the Pacific Island Forum was really the highest set of commitments at a regional level around recognition of human rights concerns around West Papua. So this is now a text that came out of Tuvalu, out of the Leaders Forum, out of the Leaders Communique that I'll just talk you through now. So this is the text that eventually worked its way through the Leaders Communique. So the 19 leaders, including Australia, agreed to this text. The leaders reaffirm recognition of Indonesia's sovereignty over West Papua, acknowledge the reported escalation in violence and the continued allegation of human rights abuses in West Papua, and agreed to re-emphasise and reinforce the forum's position of raising its concerns over the violence. The leaders called on all parties to protect and uphold the human rights of all residents and to work to address the root causes of the conflict by peaceful means. And that language around root causes is particularly important. They agreed to maintain open and constructive dialogue with Indonesia on alleged human rights abuses and violations in West Papua. West Papua, Papua language. Welcome the invitation by Indonesia for a mission to West Papua by the UN Human Rights Commission for Human Rights, and strongly encourage both sides to finalise the timing of the visit for an evidence-based, informed report of the situation to be provided before the next Pacific Island Forum Leaders meeting in 2020. So here, what essentially we did was mobilise a campaign for a visit by the UN Human Rights Commissioner for Human Rights into West Papua. And this is really about advocating the language of human rights and about getting an independent fact-finding mission into Indonesia to bring a level of international human rights scrutiny to these really critical issues that are taking place at the moment, and that are that we need to galvanise international attention around. So that communique was taken by the leadership. All leaders endorsed it. And then Ralph Regenvanu took that communique made by the Pacific Island Forum and went to a meeting of the African, Caribbean and Pacific states that was held in Nairobi in December. And because the Pacific Island states as a bloc had made that original communique, the entire bloc of Pacific, Caribbean and Pacific, of African, Caribbean and Pacific states were prepared then to pass a resolution that went even further and that made the following declaration. So the declaration text reads, conduct a mission into West Papua to provide evidence-based informed report on the human rights situation, to allow international media access to West Papua, to provide independent coverage on the human rights situation, again linked to the Pacific Island Forum Leaders meeting, to work together to address the root causes of the conflict in West Papua by peaceful means, and to uphold human rights of all residents in West Papua, and importantly, to seek to include the human rights situation in West Papua as a standing item on the agenda of the United Nations Human Rights Council. So all of this work is about really elevating the human rights set of issues to these international forums to getting recognition around these escalating crises that are happening in West Papua, particularly mobilising this international agenda, seeking these state parties and these member countries to back these resolutions so that we can get political consensus around the need for UN human rights access into West Papua. So since then, there have been a series of statements that have been issued by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that have noted escalating violence in Papua and West Papua, deaths of Papuan students, attacks on Papua students. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has issued reports about nationalist militia and groups that have been involved in violence and threats. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has issued statements on actions by the Indonesian government. She's issued a series of statements around the trends of escalating violence, and she's issued statements around her concern about the blanket internet shutdown and that this is going to contravene human rights around freedom of expression. There have been 4 communications relating to joint allegation letters by several mandates. There's been a statement issued by the UN Human Rights Commissioner about the alarming situation in West Papua, where she said many activists, human rights defenders, environmental actors and journalists have been subjected to arbitrary detention, arrest, harassment and violence, and have faced highly punitive criminal charges and sentences. And more broadly, what has happened is that there's been various statements of support of 83 states for the UN human rights, for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to lead a delegation into West Papua. So really what all of this body of work is about building that growing international consensus into that space. You can see that the language is very much orientated towards human rights, and it is about moving towards Human Rights Council resolutions. It's about building consensus through all of these processes. And it's a broad set of political advocacy strategies that are driving very much towards that kind of agenda. It's moving from the Pacific outwards because there's a recognition of the importance of moving from Pacific member states into a broader ACP region, into a broader consensus of that international political agenda. And that is, that's really the work of that political leadership. It's really the work that ULMWP has been championing. So yeah, that's the legal political work that I wanted to speak to today.
Okay, sorry, our tech guys just stepped out, so I'm learning on the job really quick. But Siobhan, thank you so much. That was insightful, clear, and gave us all a lot of knowledge that we didn't have before. I'd love to give you time for questions, but I also know that people need coffee. So what we might do is break for 15 minutes for coffee, and then we'll do questions at the end of the seminar. I understand that means that a lot of, some speakers need to go. But what we might do is, if there are questions that come up on the chat on the side that aren't able to be answered because the speakers have had to leave, we might start a different forum. I'm not sure what yet, but where there's ongoing kind of Q&A between speakers and participants at a different time, and we can keep the conversation going that way. So we'll break. We'll come back at 11:15, where we're going to hear from the People's
Papuan People's Petition.
Papuan People's Petition. So the people in Papua who are opposing the renewal of special autonomy. So we're going to have a speaker from within West Papua up next. So try and be back at 11:15 sharp. There's a cafe just across over at the library. And yeah, come back as soon as you can. Thank you. And I'll press pause on Zoom, and then I'll not pause, but I'll mute and stop the video, and then we'll come back. See you in 15. Thanks, everyone. We've got Sam. I need to put Sam back on spotlight. I can't see Sam Awam. He's no longer there. That I can see.
No, I'll call him.
Okay, we're just getting friend Sam Awam from within West Papua online. So it's just taking a couple of minutes.
I'm calling her. Kom, gabung sudah nih yang senang tunggu saja nih. Pas gabung mana? Bisa dia.
Oh, okay. I just
coba
nyalain
video kah?
Maaf.
Okay, yuk.
Di mana?
First page, one of two.
I've asked him to turn on his video.
Yeah, I saw him a minute ago.
Ah,
2 of 2.
Page 2. Here we go.
Okay.
Oh, it's not.
Nah, itu. Okay.
I'm
there. Up there.
Yeah.
Yeah. By spotlight. Okay. All right. Quiet in the lecture theatre, please. We're about to recommence the seminar. Now I need to mute. So you go ahead and introduce Ronnie.
Oh, yeah.
And then I'll,
Thank you, everyone. Apology, we start off a little bit, few minutes over, but in this second session, we will continue with the seminar, and please drop in some questions there. There's a few more questions that has been written here, so it's great. We'll respond to that towards the end as well. And if there's some of the speakers still with us, we'll get them to respond directly as well. For now, we will cross over to West Papua in Manokwari, and it's an honor as well to have Sam Awam, who is the spokesperson for the Petisi Rakyat Papua, or Papuan People's Petition, as a spokesperson in the Home Affairs, like within Papua and wider region, given that international spokesperson Victor Yema couldn't be part of this conversation. And so Sam will be speaking for a few minutes, 5, and then it will be interpreted or translated into English by Veronica Coman. Jadi napi nanti bicara 5 menit, sekian begitu baru nanti kawan Vero lanjut dengan bahasa Inggris. So for now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sam Awam. Napi lanjut.
Terima kasih buat forum Papua Project. Kami dari Petisi Rakyat Papua, saya Sam Awam sebagai juru bicara dalam negeri. petisi rakyat Papua. Seharusnya Victor Yemo sebagai juru bicara internasional yang harus di forum ini, tetapi dia ditangkap 10 Mei yang lalu sehingga saya harus berbicara di forum ini. Saya juga meminta maaf karena kita tidak terlalu mempersiapkan materi, tetapi dalam 1 minggu ini kita persiapkan aksi untuk pembebasan Victor Yemo tanpa syarat, dan hari ini sedang berlangsung di Manokwari, di Sorong, juga di Indonesia, itu di Jakarta, Bandung, Semarang, Jogja, Surabaya, melakukan aksi serempak yang sama untuk menyerukan pembebasan, tapi juga menolak otonomi khusus Jilid 2 dan rakyat Papua menuntut hak menentukan nasib sendiri. Jadi di hari yang ini, sehingga waktu untuk mempersiapkan ini belum maksimal, tapi saya pikir bahwa forum ini cukup tepat untuk itu. Silakan Vero.
I'll be speaking as if I'm Sam. I'm Sam Awom. I'm the national spokesperson of Papuan People's Petition. It's supposed to be Victor Yemo, the international spokesperson, who will be speaking today, but because he was arbitrarily arrested on the 9th of May, so he needs to be speaking today. I apologize that I didn't prepare much of the what I'm going to speak today because I'm busy on consolidating the protests throughout West Papua and Indonesia today. There are protests in Manokwari, Sorong, Jakarta, Bandung, Semarang, Yogyakarta, and Surabaya. And we are calling to release all West Papua political prisoners. The protesters also calling for their rejection of renewal of special autonomy and calling for the real self-determination. That's why I cannot prepare much for today. Lanjut.
Petisi rakyat Papua untuk tolak Otsus adalah konsultasi rakyat sipil untuk menjelaskan situasi sejelas-jelasnya sebenarnya kepada seluruh komunitas internasional bahwa seluruh rakyat Papua, mayoritas rakyat Papua menolak otonomi khusus dan mau menjelaskan bahwa apa yang dikatakan pemerintah Jakarta adalah situasi yang tidak sebenarnya di Papua. Saat ini ada 110 organisasi sipil yang melakukan konsultasi ke seluruh kampung-kampung di West Papua dengan situasi darurat sipil yang hari ini kami alami. Tetapi sampai per April tahun ini 2021 ada sekitar 714.666 suara yang kami rangkum sebagai tahap yang dilakukan. Tetapi kami akan tetap melakukan konsultasi petisi sampai memaksimalkan di seluruh wilayah. Silakan, Vero.
So by rejecting the extension of special autonomy, we are calling that about the special autonomy should be based on consultation with the civilians that can explain the truth of what's really happening in West Papua. That is that the people of West Papua are rejecting the extension of special autonomy. What Jakarta has been saying about the condition is untrue. And we now consist of, there are 110 organizations now join the Papuan People's Petition. We conduct consultation in every villages, and also despite the obstacles that's been prevented by Indonesian security forces. However, as of today, we have gathered more than 714,000 signatures. and we will still continue to conduct our consultation and maximize our efforts. Lanjut.
Petisi Rakyat Papua juga menjelaskan hari ini bahwa ada krisis kemanusiaan darurat sipil di tanah Papua. Hari ini ada perang antara Tentara Pembebasan Nasional Organisasi Papua Merdeka yang hari ini berlangsung dan sedang berlangsung, dan Petisi Rakyat Papua sebagai organisasi sipil mendukung apa yang dilakukan oleh Tentara Pembebasan Nasional untuk mempertahankan seluruh wilayah-wilayah adat di negeri ini, tanah Papua. Petisi Rakyat Papua juga mau menegaskan bahwa labelisasi terorisme kepada TPN OPM adalah bentuk nyata Jakarta tidak membuka ruang sama sekali di Papua, dan Jakarta ingin memaksakan kehendak sendiri di dalam menentukan situasi di Papua. Hari ini ada ribuan pengungsi diduga di Intan Jaya, di Puncak, dan di wilayah-wilayah pegunungan yang lainnya, yang hari ini sulit terdeteksi karena ruang semua ditutup oleh militer, dan jumlah militer yang dikirim TNI Polri begitu banyak, ribuan. Bahkan koneksi internet dimatikan agar tidak ada situasi, tidak bisa menjelaskan situasi yang sebenarnya di tanah Papua.
Okay. Yeah. So there's currently ongoing humanitarian crisis in West Papua. There's war between the West Papua National Liberation Army and the Indonesian Army. We, as the civil society organization, civilians, we support the West Papua National Liberation Army to defend our ancestral lands. The recent terrorism labeling by the Indonesian government shows that there is no room for democratic space in West Papua, that Jakarta, as always, forced their policy about the situation in West Papua. There are thousands of internally displaced peoples across the Central Highlands in West Papua, in Intan Jaya, Puncak, Nduga, Puncak Jaya, and everything is information about this is closed by the Indonesian military, and the Indonesian military keeps sending troops while thousands of them, while the internet in West Papua is being shut down. Lanjut.
Saat ini situasi di Papua bahwa media-media semua dikuasai oleh Jakarta untuk mengontrol semua berita, sehingga berita-berita yang dikeluarkan sangat-sangat tidak berimbang dan sangat tidak sesuai dengan situasi di lapangan atau situasi di tanah Papua. Kami juga mau menegaskan kepada seluruh jaringan internasional bahwa ruang akses publik atau ini ditutup sama sekali di Papua, sehingga Petisi Rakyat Papua akan mengkonsultasikan rakyat dalam satu konsultasi yang melibatkan seluruh elemen gerakan rakyat menuju ke musyawarah rakyat untuk memutuskan sikap politik rakyat Papua menyangkut situasi terakhir Jakarta memaksakan kehendaknya di tanah Papua.
National medias are all controlled by Jakarta. All the news published are not balanced and biased. And I'd like to tell the to international network that there is no access for West Papuan peoples to speak. Therefore, we will continue to consolidate the people to so we are going to hold a musyawarah rakyat, the people's assembly, to make our political statement of about Jakarta that's forcing its views and policy on us. Lanjut. 7 menit lagi, 6 menit lagi.
Ya, petisi rakyat Papua menyerukan kepada solidaritas internasional untuk bersama-sama mencari solusi konkret penyelesaian politik bangsa Papua untuk menyelesaikan konflik yang sudah hampir 60 tahun, terhitung dari tahun 61. Sehingga sudah saatnya solidaritas internasional menyerukan kepada seluruh komunitas internasional untuk mencari solusi perdamaian dalam perundingan antara Jakarta dan West Papua untuk mencari solusi konkret yang difasilitasi oleh internasional, ya, untuk mencari solusi konkret menyangkut masa depan Papua. Karena 20 tahun otonomi khusus berlangsung, genosida, perampasan tanah adat, investasi besar-besaran, dan pencaplokan pendudukan di wilayah-wilayah adat sedang terjadi. Dan hari ini menegaskan sikap Jakarta bahwa koloni pendudukan saat ini sedang terjadi di Papua dengan pengiriman jumlah pasukan dalam ribuan.
The PRP hereby asks the international community to together find the solution of this long-standing conflict, to finally find the solution that's to the conflict that's been going since the 1961. That it is time that there's international solidarity to together find a peaceful resolution. That is a mediation between Jakarta and West Papua, facilitated by international parties to find this peaceful resolution. There has been ongoing genocide, land grabbing, deforestation, and other atrocities in West Papua. And at the same time, there have been a further militarization in West Papua. Ya, penutup.
Petisi rakyat Papua akan selalu bekerja mengawal seluruh konsultasi rakyat. Kami akan berkampanye untuk pembebasan tanpa syarat Victor Yemo sebagai juru bicara internasional, tetapi juga berkampanye tentang menolak kebijakan Jakarta otonomi khusus dan solusi perdamaian hak menentukan sendiri harus dijalankan. Dan berikut bahwa petisi rakyat Papua mengajak seluruh komunitas internasional untuk memposisikan diri bahwa West Papua adalah bagian terpenting di dalam mendorong perdamaian dunia. Terima kasih.
The Papuan People's Petition will always work. We will continue to consolidate the people on the ground, that mainly to campaign for West Papuan political prisoners all to be released, including our international spokesperson, Victor Yemo. We will also ask to, our main demand is to reject the extension of special autonomy and to demand our real self-determination. The PRP also would like to invite the international community to position yourself to see West Papua as part of, I mean, the conflict resolution in West Papua is part of the peace in the world.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
As the message is clear. Sorry, okay, thank you. Yes, so the message is clear that there's a push free political prisoners, demilitarization, and resist against the labeling of the freedom fighters as terrorists, and also to call for the government to open the democratic space so people can freely express views and also expression. So thank you for that insight and also update. And basically, as Sam Awam has highlighted, the situation, the blackout, especially with access to internet, phone, and media, has somewhat limited information or news from getting out, and for foreign journalists and human rights groups from entering. And in a case to represent, the next speaker will invite Emeritus Professor Ted Wolfers, who is of politics at the University of Wollongong. He first traveled to Papua New Guinea for teaching position, unaware that this initial visit would be the foundation of a long patient and association. He served as a permanent consultant to the committee charged with developing a constitution for an independent PNG, was centrally involved as successive PNG governments and contributed to the Bougainville peace process. He has served on the United Nations panel on opportunity and participation as an expert at regional seminars of the UN Special Committee on Decolonization, and been involved in World Bank roundtables and parliamentary committees in Australia, New Zealand, PNG, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands, and has served as an advisor to PNG delegations, to the UN General Assembly, and the UN Security Council. Ted was also present at the so-called Act of Free Choice, and he is here today to tell us about what he witnessed. Please welcome Emeritus Professor Ted Wolfers.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about something that I actually wasn't able to talk about for many years. I simply couldn't cope with what I'd seen and heard, and found it very difficult to discuss it. I should perhaps preface my remarks by saying I just happened to be there for 6 out of the 8 meetings of the Act. I shout. I'm quite good at that. Sorry, please. The reason I was in West Papua for the Act Free of Choice was simply that an Australian journalist I knew wanted to go there. He had a plane to do it, or a pilot who would take us, but it was too expensive. So by sharing the costs, I actually got to go there. It was as simple as that. So I had no official role for anybody whatsoever. I don't think I was particularly well prepared for it, though I had known members of the Papuan community in Port Moresby. And it was a sufficiently scarifying experience, I suppose, that it's something I didn't even write about until a couple of years ago. I kept meaning to, but I never did. And you know, I've since done a bit of checking up, and some of the people I travelled with have written briefly about it, but not, again, in great detail. I think the interest I have in it is not simply an academic interest. When, during the Bougainville peace negotiations, there was all sorts of conversations about whether to hold a referendum on independence, and all sorts of smart aleck comments coming from foreign government officials, if I can put it like that. And so I used the West Papuan experience as a way of saying to people, if you're going to do it properly. It's not a joke, it's not a game. And I think by arguing that way, some people who were sceptical or thought it was a game actually became serious about it. And of course, Bougainville has since held a referendum in which 97.7% of the people voted for independence. So that's still obviously under discussion. It seems to me that to understand the Act of Free Choice, we need to think of it as being actually at the intersection of two relatively closely related processes. One was decolonisation and the other was Cold War diplomacy. Because I remember when I saw some of the things that happened that weren't supposed to happen, none of the diplomats in the room noticed. Or if they noticed, they didn't say anything, they didn't do anything. And I think it says something that's important to bear in mind when we look at the future too, about how people in diplomatic employ often have to look at the world and the limited scope for what they often feel they can do. I mean, when I talk about some of the things I saw, you know, there were Australian, Russian, American, other diplomats in the room. I don't know what their reports back to headquarters were. I know that none of them intervened while events were underway. I think it is important to bear in mind, as I say, that for many of these people, I think what was really uppermost on their minds was that Indonesia had only recently emerged from a fear that had been held that it might go communist or be run by communists. There was a fear for regional stability. So the interest was not, I don't think, on the part of officials in the rights of Papuans. I think it was an interest in maintaining what they regarded as regional stability. The other thing that struck me as I prepared what I hope will tell me will be a short talk, one thing that rather struck me also was that when you read the actual UN report, is the way they talk about West Papuan society. I found the report, as I reread it in the last few weeks, more offensive than I'd ever recalled from before. That, for example, the way in which Ambassador Ortiz Sanz said, you know, that it was all carried out despite the recognised enormous difficulties faced by the Indonesian government in this matter. Its accomplishment may show the sincere determination of the Indonesian government and people to fulfil an international obligation in the best possible way. And then the next sentence is, in West Irian, there exists, as is generally known, one of the most primitive and undeveloped communities in the world. To measure the method and conduct of the Act of Free Choice in such a community against purely Western democratic methods and procedures would indeed be erroneous and unrealistic. Now, I think there is a real issue there which continues not just for Papuans, but for Melanesia more generally to the present day, which is presenting a more positive image of even traditional Melanesian society. Melanesian society wasn't bereft of knowledge and understanding, as most of us know. Years ago, for the fun of it, I collected a whole lot of mathematical systems from around Melanesia. They ended up being republished in American maths journals without my submitting it, and my being invited to several different countries to talk about it. Now, that wasn't my genius. It was the fact that it was something really interesting that is overlooked in Melanesian society. And there are many other things like that, which I think pose part of the problem that West Papuans face in advancing their cause. As I said, I think the Act of Free Choice is best understood as essentially a diplomatic enterprise rather than one concerned directly with the interests of communities or interaction with them. It was still the case that there were parts of West Papua that were not under government control even, that were still relatively living just in a traditional way. And you could certainly see real differences in values and behaviours. I remember after the Act of Free Choice in Wamena, when I went outside, the people who'd been at the meeting before rushing outside and taking off their tops and trousers and putting back their penis gourds, because that's what they wore, that's what the men wore. And it ought to be recognised and made part of the much bigger story. There's no doubt in my mind that considerable parts of the Act were not conducted with integrity. That, for example, before the first consultation in Meraki, I remember we were walking along a street and suddenly there were people moving and we just followed them and we ended up in a room. Eight gone or to go? Okay, well, please tell me. We went, we walked into a building where there were people being handed briefcases and tobacco in readiness for the next day's event. So that I think we need to be aware that these were not just straightforward walking into a room for a consultation, but there was a lot of premeditated selection and preparation for what happened. And I think that has to form, I personally think that if you were trying to reopen this question, there would be serious questions that could be asked about the integrity of the Act of Free Choice and therefore what it means in the longer term. And I don't think that, as I say, as I read this stuff in the last couple of weeks, because you told me to, I was a bit shocked to be reminded of some of the things that I had observed. And I think it'd be worth having a very careful analysis that to talk about our fellow human beings in the way that UN officials and others did was truly quite worrying, if that's the basis on which they were operating. It's also important to bear in mind, I think, as we talk about that, we're in a different environment now with other independent Melanesian states, but they also, of course, have to manage their relations with Indonesia, and that can be quite complex. And that's why, for example, after a great deal of negotiation, Papua New Guinea saw a need to have a proper close diplomatic relationship with Indonesia, but perhaps unusually in the world, the treaty that was entered into is not a treaty of friendship, it's a treaty of mutual respect. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind. My recollection of the Act of Free Choice was that it was, firstly, people were given things to persuade them to act in a certain way beforehand. It was as you walked in, there was a whole set of senior Indonesian officials sitting at the front, making it very clear what would happen. Not saying it, but making it clear who controlled the event. And it's fair to say that, these were highly organised meetings. It was not people getting up and speaking spontaneously from the heart. It was a highly organised set of meetings. And the selection of the meetings themselves was quite arbitrary, involving officials choosing the 1,025 people who were part of the process. During the meetings, there were certainly nationalist exhortations from prominent Indonesian leaders. There were material inducements as well as threats and actual intimidation. And of course, people were given things to persuade them to act in a certain way. I think it's fair to say that when one walked down the street, for example, one would frequently find people either coming up and trying to talk to you in a corner, expressing strong views against remaining part of Indonesia, or people walking past and throwing at us petitions saying we don't want to be part of Indonesia. But there was no formal mechanism for the receipt of this. But there was, I'm not saying everybody was like this, but there was quite a degree of activism when one went out into the streets. There was activism on the other side too. I remember being dragged by somebody to join in a dance celebrating things. I was watching it and was suddenly found myself being dragged to be part of it. But I think it's fair to say that there was a great deal of, well, certainly in the streets, one saw a reasonable measure of concern. I remember in Manokwari, when a young fellow went running through the street calling Sendiri, Sendiri, freedom, freedom. And being inexperienced and foolish myself, I went towards him. He was almost dragged over me by the Indonesian officials grabbing him. And then I looked up, and in the harbour outside, the ceremonial fleet had turned around and its cannons were trained on us. So it was not, I believe, a set of activities that can reasonably be described as free and fair. And, as I say, the international community was complicit in it because of the diverse concerns they had about what had been happening and what might still happen in Indonesia. It's also true, of course, that some of the Melanesian participants made a point of cheering and clapping and even carrying Indonesian leaders after the votes because they might have been genuinely enthusiastic in some cases, but in others they were being part of a much bigger story. And there were occasions when I can remember when I was at one of the acts of free choice, an Australian journalist went off to the Telegraph Office to send his message. The Indonesian, or the Urianese behind the counter, seeing the nature of the story and that it hadn't been cleared by officials, made every effort to get it on the wire and back overseas. And as I say, a senior Indonesian official subsequently came and told me what a naughty boy I was being. And I certainly felt, I can't prove it, but I have quite some evidence that that it was necessary to carry my tape recordings and photographs in my pockets and not leave them in my hotel room, because somehow or other I had these bags that moved themselves whenever I wasn't there. So there was protest, but it had to be very carefully conducted, usually on an individual basis. And, throwing petitions at journalists and people like me wasn't really going to get you anywhere. So I personally think that there would be some advantage in I don't believe that it's impossible to raise the question of the integrity of the process, not just address the really big issues, but talk about what it was that the UN was doing. And as I say, if you read the reports carefully, I think there's a fair bit of evidence in them about a condescending attitude and a failure to uphold standards, even by very prominent UN officials. And I think that might be worth looking at. At the same time, I think we need to be aware that in certain respects, the situation of West Papua is not unique. All over the world, there are countries composed of entities that were put together by people drawing straight lines on maps at meetings in Europe. So there is a real issue there about, it's not just, I don't think, about Indonesia, but about many other parts of the world where these similar issues exist, and where I don't know how you raise that globally, but it's because there are also, of course, real interests in maintaining many of these boundaries. But there are, in many ways, the situation in West Papua is not unique, but I do think the role of the UN in the Act of Free Choice, the way it was conducted, the way it was reported, raises very serious issues about the integrity of a United Nations operation, that it wouldn't hurt perhaps to raise some of those issues now, not because you're after particular individuals and processes, but because that was the way many of those things were conducted at that point in the aftermath of the worst of the Cold War, and where diplomats were perceiving what was going on through perhaps a different prism than we would use today. Do you want me to stop and shut up? Yep.
Thank you, Emeritus Professor Ted Wolters, for giving us a very insightful historical context, and your observation and experience with it gives us an insight into that period. And it is kind of like those stories that you are a living testament or history to that context of what happened in that period. And so thank you for that. For now, we are going to introduce another speaker, and the next speaker is Brother Hippolytus Wange. And I'll call Hippo. Brother Hippo is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University. He conducted fieldwork in West Papua in 2018, 2019, and his work on the counter-insurgency operation in Duga, co-authoring with Kemi Webb Gannon, has been published in the Contemporary Southeast Asia. A paper with Shane Bata on Indonesian autonomy, explaining divergent self-government outcomes in Aceh and Papua, will be published in Publius, the Journal of Federalism. And another paper with Stephanie Lawson on the West Papua issue in Pacific Regional Politics, explaining Indonesia's foreign policy failure, will be also published in the Pacific Review Journal. So with further ado, I would like to welcome Brother Hippo to come and give us an update on the Induga crisis. Thank you.
So thank you everyone, Tony, Kemi and Jim also for the West Papuan project. Yeah.
Oh no, sorry.
Yeah, audio. Yep, video. Yep. Just click OK. Oh, that one there.
Okay. So I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I also extend that respect to the land of West Papua and indigenous Papuans that are still in ongoing conflict. So basically my talk today is based on my fieldwork back in 2018 and 2019. And I will start also with switching off the light a little bit because I want to show a clip.
Sound clip?
Yeah, there's a short video.
Okay.
Because the light will be.
Where
video will be. I think. Somewhere here. Oh yeah, over here.
Okay, just a moment.
Okay,
because we'll need to. Sure. It's all right. It's here.
Okay. So
this. That's not going to work because. Apologies. This may take a second or two. Okay, microphone here. What's this going to work? And the microphone off. Let's see if that works.
Okay, I think I will skip this one. Okay.
Just a moment. There we go.
Okay. So yeah, kind of a short context about what's going on in Duga. Duga is actually one of the remote areas in central of West Papua, kind of a high poverty area in the area with high level of regional disparity with other regions outside Papua. Duga itself also one of the few areas that encounter late colonial presence. The Dutch presence in Highland Papua was in 1954 through the first government administrative post built in Wamena. In 1961, the Dutch began to build the state road number 1 in Wamena. It was about 80 kilometers. Some of the indigenous tribes who came down to Wamena, including the Duga tribe, saw the road with suspicion since they thought it will create problems, mainly related to the land. When the Dutch left West Papua in 1962, they did not administer the bulk of areas in the Central Highland, including Duga. Duga first a bitter experience with Indonesia. So here's kind of the how they interacted with modernity, with the state. With Indonesia, it was back in 1977, 1978, through the military operation. One of the military operation well known for the Duga community. It was called, the code name is Operasi Kikis, the chipping away operation. Mostly in up to mountain areas, Wamena, Timika, Lanijaya, Puncak Jaya. In order to secure Indonesian control over West Papua after the controversial Act of Free Choice 1969, the Suharto regime deployed thousands of soldiers to oversee the Papuans. The locals in Wamena still remember when and how the Indonesian soldiers took helicopters to swipe the locals who opposed the result of the so-called Act of Free Choice in mountain areas. That's to secure the support for Indonesia. And the second reason for the military operation was about to secure the area for preparation for the national election 1977. Even some local tribes in Wamena collaborated to point specific locations in Duga. Today, some elders from Duga still feel betrayed by their own fellows in Wamena who helped the Indonesian military back in the 1970s. The second operation is the so-called Mapenduma military operation. Many of you here are well known with this kind of operation. Involved, right now he's a defense minister, Mr. Prabowo Subianto. Back there, he was still a lieutenant. So during the military operation, hundreds of Duga killed by Indonesian soldiers to save the host's life. 16 foreign and Indonesian researchers from WWF, Cambridge University and Universitas Nasional Jakarta were kidnapped by Kelly Kualik and his group. His deputies were Elmin Silas Kogoya, Daniel Yudas Kogoya, and Matius Murray Kualik. Using an international committee of Red Cross helicopter and supported by some drones provided by the British, Prabowo lead the massive military operation in Mapenduma district in May 1996. The generation of this era still carries deep trauma, which prevented them from embracing Indonesian identity. The second generation of Duga lost their bright future to get access to education. So 1970s, 1990s, and now 2018. So the military operation started in December 2018, all the way until today, under the code name of Newang Kawi military operation. So here's the kind of the highlight, one of the source of the problem for Dugas, because there is some sort of a so-called big national project, Trans-Papuan Highway. I don't know if you guys can see, it's right here, Kenyam and Wamena, when the kind of conflict and operation started. And this kind of the handwritten map by the one refugee, close friend of mine. He wrote this kind of a map to describe when the location of the first bombing, air bomb, in 4 districts, in Nikuri, Yigi, Dal, and Bua. You can take a look later on. So kind of the condition of the IDPs. Right now, the problem is also about humanitarian efforts. They have to struggle on daily basis. And since the status of the IDPs right now, according to Indonesian government, is not clear based on law number, where is it? There is a specific law, law number 7/2012 concerning the handling of social conflict, and law number 24/2007 concerning disaster management. The Papuan political context is missing from the 2 laws. That also prevents the government, particularly the provincial government, to help the displaced Duga. So the one that we are seeing right now is how they cope with their trauma. It operates at 3 levels, from society, a group, and individual level. And this some sort of long-term impacts of transgenerational trauma in Duga. One that I want to point specifically on is resistance toward the state. It is increasing either in the forms of taking up arms against the state, or they will reject the kind of the state presence in Central Highland of Papua. So I will skip this part because it will take some time. But basically the key point is that against the context of ongoing armed conflict in Duga, the central government recently launched the so-called new labeling, the terrorist labeling, Papuan's terrorist group. And the objectives of this labeling is depoliticize political aspiration and activities of Papuan's nationalist groups, and to give a license to take necessary actions, including violating Papuan's human rights. And the second form of securitization is media campaign. And the third one, the well-known form, is military deployment. The massive military deployment is controlled highly by the so-called Joint Defense Force, Kogat Wilhan. In Papua, it's called the Kogat Wilhan 3. It covers Maluku and West Papua. They are basically dealing with the military operation. The one that doing the territorial operation is led by the Regional Territorial Command, CODAM, and then Sub-Regional Territorial Command, or COREM. So this is basically the kind of the map of the military units and locations across Indonesia. And the one that you are seeing on your right is the Kogat Wilhan 3. And this kind of a still ongoing build up of my project about how we measure military deployment in West Papua. So basically from 2019, it was 10,282 soldiers. 2020, 8,854. Up to May this month, it is recorded 5,709 soldiers, and it will be another 2 battalions coming from East Java and Central Java. Probably by late June, we will have around 6,000 soldiers. And from 2019 and 2020, majority of them have been returned to their original bases outside Papua, but there are some kind of switch that will be deployed to West Papua. So I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really amazing to really get a bit of the context of the conflict right now. And it's happening as we speak. And speaking of what's happening now, just a quick update as well. In Manokwari, there is blockade by the activists. They have occupied 5 spaces. And now there is that intensity of negotiations happening, as well as it's unfolding. Events are unfolding in Manokwari. So there'll be information coming out. We hope that nothing of such magnitude of mass arrest, but yeah, the situation is intense. But for now, I'd like to take the opportunity to welcome Jim Emsley to come and also give some perspective as well. So please welcome Jim.
How can I get my...
Yep. This was your audience.
Yeah. Okay, thanks Hippo for that. That was great. I'm going to speak very briefly. This is a paper I wrote a few years ago, trying to get into the demographics, which I've written about for a long time. Just as a point of any statistics that you read in these situations, it has to be taken with a great deal of salt, because, for instance, what we just saw in Nduga, it would be impossible to conduct any sort of meaningful census in that arrangement. There was also, the figures are obviously very rubbery. There's also a tendency in some of the Papuan communities to inflate the number of people to get more benefit from the government. But what I specifically want to talk about is these figures here, which were, because most of the time I've tried to do the demographics, it hasn't been broken down between Papuan and non-Papuan people. So you're really speculating. These figures were briefly on the Indonesian statistics site in Jayapura, which did from the 2010 census. And you'll note that in each regency, they have got the population numbers for Papuan and non-Papuan people. And what we see is that there's an enormous divide between the highlands regions, in roughly an area the size of Great Britain, and the lowlands and coastal regions, where predominantly there are now non-Papuan people in those regions, or in the Papuan, in the highlands, it's still an overwhelming majority of people are Papuans. From the 2010 census, out of a total population of 3.63 million people, around about, according to these figures, about 2.5 million of those were still Papuans. So that suggests that at that stage there are still, given the rubbery nature of the figures, but there was still about 68% of Papuans across the board. I can't get any of these equivalent statistics for the 2020 census yet, but by just looking at those numbers, if we go to the next little graph, we can see this is a breakdown between the regencies like Jayapura, Kota Jayapura, the city of Jayapura, where the black indicates non-Papuans, that there's a big majority of people there, and of non-Papuans, while when we get into the highlands regions, to quickly quote a few figures, you know, so in Jayapura, there's 65% non-Papuans, in Kurum, Mimika, Merauke, 62%, but then we go to Lani Jaya, it's still not, in 2010, 99% Melanesian Papuan people. Paniai, 97%, Jayawijaya, 90%. So we can see that there's two very clear population breakdowns depending on the topography of the country. And it's in that context that the road is such a seminal event, because the people in the highlands fear, probably quite rightly, that the road will allow access to not just military forces, but settlers and to logging companies and to mining companies. And we can see that unfolding now. And that seems to have been or at least not, if it's not the key factor, it's certainly one of the major factors of why there's been a recent upsurge of violence in the last few years, and the killing of the road workers in 2018, which started off the cycle, was against the road, partly at least. And what we're seeing now is that cycle has escalated to the murder of the intelligence chief a couple of weeks ago, and we're looking at an even greater military operations. So I will leave it there. And if anyone wants a bit more information, they can look at this paper, which was published in the Journal of Asia and Pacific Studies, the Asia Pacific Journal in Japan Focus, a couple of years ago. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Short and sharp. And thank you. That really reflects in terms of the neo-colonialism settlement program that is really pretty much underlying what's the intent from Jakarta. And good to have that as well in the context. And now I'd like to invite Veronica Koman. Veronica Koman is an Indonesian human rights lawyer focusing on West Papua issues. Her clients include West Papuan charged with treason for peacefully demanding their right to self-determination. One of the cases now is with Victor Yemo, and she's wanted by the Indonesian police on politicized charges, forcing her to live in exile. She was awarded the 2019 Sir Ronald Wilson Human Rights Awards. With that, please give it up to you.
Oh yeah, okay. Thank you, Ronnie, for the generous introduction. Yeah, so before I start my own presentation, I'd like to make a quick comment on Hippo's presentation. From the short clip, it's obvious who are the real terrorists in West Papua. That those refugees, those IDPs are terrorized by the Indonesian military and BRIMOB, the paramilitary police. And also I'd like to add about the military deployment. According to Veronica Kusumariati, she's an anthropologist at a PhD at Harvard University. According to her recent research, that the current ratio of security forces and people in West Papua is 15 security forces per 1,000 people. That is higher than when Aceh was just finished their Aceh's military dome, apa sih? Dome? Yeah, military operation area. That is, at that time, Aceh's ratio is 13 security forces per 1,000 people. And compared to Java, it's 2 security forces per 1,000 people. So it's actually, West Papua has already been a military operation area. And this is just from available data that according to my correspondence with the Kontras, is one of NGO giant in Indonesia. They asked for freedom of information request to the Indonesian Army. What's the official number? How many soldiers are there in West Papua right now? Yet the TNI wouldn't answer. So yeah, how many actually we never know. Not yet, at least. So now I'll go to my presentation that I divide this into 2 big points. The first one about armed conflict. This is complementary to Hippo's presentation. And second one about Victor Yemo's case. The first one about the armed conflict. So it's the conflict status in West Papua has escalated into armed conflict according to international humanitarian law definition. Because under the IHL, International Humanitarian Law, there are several criteria for one conflict to be classified as such. That is the frequency, intensity, from the weaponry, and from whether the armed group is how organized they are. So right now, the armed conflict is not just flaring in Intan Jaya, Nduga, of course, Puncak Jaya, and also just this week, including in Yahukimo and Star Mountains, regencies that we actually is kind of not that intense, but it's happening even there. So it's really getting more intensified, and the Liberation Army, the West Papua National Liberation Army, is getting even much more organized now, and they are getting larger in number. Why? Because of one of the reasons is because of the neglected displaced people. This we receive reports that many of the young people, because tens of thousands, we are talking about at least 50,000 now, because they're neglected and they are getting desperate. The cycle of hatred towards the Indonesian military doing military operation to their people, then they join the Liberation Army. So that is just one of the main reasons, but we also receive reports that even well-educated Papuans are now joining the Liberation Army. Like the commander in Tembagapura, who was killed earlier this year, Hengki Waman, earlier this year, yeah, he was a university graduate. So yeah, it's not only about, this is really about ideology. It's not about, you know, just being desperate and then joining. No, graduates also, university graduates also are joining. And we are talking about, according to IHL, it's classified as non-international armed conflict, NIAC, non-international armed conflict. But although actually it could be categorized as war on national liberation, but there are several prerequisites for armed conflict to be classified as war on national liberation, such as the host country, Indonesia, must be ratified this additional protocol, but Indonesia does not ratify it. So, and then the Liberation Army also has not declared their submission to Geneva. So it's not yet classified as war on national liberation. And also the next bit of armed conflict is about displacement. Hippo touched a lot on this, so I won't go into more detail. I just want to add that in a normal world, these displaced people should have been assisted by UNHCR, the UN Agency on Refugees, assisted by the IOM, by the ICRC, and WHO, UNICEF. But where are they? West Papua is a no-go zone for all these international organizations. And hundreds have died due to the disease and also hunger. Yeah, and another point of the armed conflict. So maybe you heard that. I think that the situation in West Papua has escalated so much that there's a little bit of shift in like human behavior. I don't know if this is actually like the correct term in anthropology, but what I'm gonna say is that teachers, people who teach, two of them were killed 2 months ago. This is shocking even for West Papuan community, because teachers and doctors are two professions, well, and church leaders are the profession that are highly respected and treasured in West Papua. Like during traditional events, the Bakar Batu ceremony, and all the good stuff will first be presented to the teachers, the doctors. But why the teachers were killed by the Liberation Army? So according to the Liberation Army, that these teachers were often, and according to the locals as well, that the teachers were often seen carrying guns. And also, yeah, so according to the Liberation Army, that these teachers are military undercovers. And after that, so I don't have any means to verify that about the actual status, civilian or military undercover. But after that event, the Papuan Church Council of Papuan Church, what is it? They made a statement asking that an MOU between Papua's Education Agency and TNI to be reviewed. Turns out there's an MOU between TNI and Papua's Education Agency that allows Indonesian soldiers to teach at schools in West Papua. But based on so I've been actually monitoring this, because since the 2019 West Papua uprising, from the social media accounts of the Indonesian Army itself, they show that they've been indoctrinating West Papuan children at schools. They go to school and then ask these children to sing Indonesian nationalistic songs, and also all the Indonesian nationalism thing. It's not teaching, it's indoctrinating. There's ideology, a war for children. And that's about the killings of the teachers. And also, we often hear that a motorbike taxi driver killed by the Liberation Army. Why? Because in West Papua, it's common knowledge that these motorbike taxi drivers are intelligence officers. I'm not saying that those victims are intelligence officers, but that's the reasoning. That's the reason why they are being attacked. And the Liberation Army always states that when they claim the responsibility of the killings, they said that these people, according to our monitoring, these people are intelligence officers. Anyway, I just want to clarify that I am not endorsing at all these killings. I just want to give another version of these incidents, because like Sam Awam said earlier, that every news is monopolized by Jakarta. And also schools, health clinics been burned down in recent in Intan Jaya and Puncak. Why again? Because this, according to Papua Police Chief himself, said that the schools and health clinics were burned by the National Liberation Army. Well, they said that it's armed criminal group, because those places been used as command posts. As command posts. So the police chief said that they are always like that. They burn at the location wherever we set up posts. So in this case, both parties violate the law of war. The Indonesian side use civilian like this, supposed to be like non-touchable civilian areas, schools and health clinics as command posts. That's a violation. And also as the retaliation to burn this down, also in violation. That's why there needs to be more mainstreaming of the understanding of international humanitarian law in West Papua urgently. And churches have been attacked. Churches have been attacked. The latest incident was just this week or last week, that from air raid, from 2 helicopters shooting down, that a church was destroyed. To my last point about armed conflict is that Indonesia is monopolized all the information about armed conflict. That you can imagine that Indonesia is setting up Iron Dome covering West Papua, preventing any information from in and out. And like right now about the armed conflict, how dangerous it is that the info is monopolized, that online, that so the local news, the local independent news, they've been struggling to cover the news, but every single news that's not in line with the TNI's version was branded as hoax, and then it's campaigned throughout social media, very massive. There are multiple contents daily, and then on multiple social media platforms, making people confused on what's really happening, and branding every information different to TNI's version as hoax. And Reuters published an investigation earlier this year saying that the TNI was behind this campaign, funded by TNI. And not just that, but also there's also propaganda. So not just hoax, but also this dividing the movement of propaganda. And about the press freedom, 2 months ago, Victor Mambor, the most prominent, how long is that? Okay, got it. Most prominent West Papuan journalist was, his car was destroyed, damaged, sorry, was damaged, and then he was also subjected to this online massive campaign. With that condition, plus Indonesia security forces are occupying roads, making it almost impossible condition for local journalists or any civilians to verify cases. And this plus internet and mobile disruptions, like nowadays, it's very hard to speak to people in the Central Highlands where the armed conflict is flaring. Yeah, so that's about armed conflict. I'm going to quickly now mention about Victor Yemo's case. So he's the international, why is Victor Yemo's case important? He's the international spokesperson of West Papua National Committee, KNPB. KNPB is the largest grassroots organization in West Papua. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of members, and hence KNPB members is the most persecuted group in West Papua. In December, 13 people, KNPB members in Merauke, were arrested just because they were members of KNPB. 6 were subjected to torture. That one in the end died in detention from his injuries. And Victor is also the spokesperson of the PRP. And so the arrest of Victor Yemo, based on he was accused of treason due to his role during the 2019 uprising, but it's just an excuse to arrest him anyway, because he is central in voicing about what's happening in West Papua as a person who lives on the ground and speaks English. That's a rare trait. And that's why he is targeted. The Papua police chief himself has said that publicly in media, yeah, I've told the investigators to just take your time slowly. I'll connect each law to. I expect life imprisonment for him. That he is facing 11 charges, including treason. That's the longest accusation that I've seen in the police letter. Of course, he was arrested without any arrest warrant, like almost all the arrests against West Papuan activists. He is now in solitary confinement. He was just afforded visits twice, not including family. He's also been giving shed food, and also he is prone to. He's not vaccinated yet for COVID. And it means that yeah, you know, it's almost impossible to keep sanitary in Indonesian jails. Are just not possible. And to conclude, how many minutes do I have? Okay, yeah, okay. I just add one more point that that's why it's very important for us to keep raising awareness, because like Indonesia really doesn't want. It's very difficult that want to monopolize information. For example, in 2018, I was there in Surabaya. I was there, so I know precisely what happened. That 233 West Papuan students were arrested just because there was one Aboriginal woman inside the dormitory. That's why, because the police panicked. Who was that foreigner with West Papuan? So like they're really afraid West Papuan speaking to international people, and that's exactly what we should do. And this Tuesday, on the 25th, it's Victor Yemo's birthday. So TAPOL organization, together with Papuan People's Petition, we hold a webinar to gather solidarity for Victor Yemo and other political prisoners, and also to what is it called? Raise awareness about why West Papuans reject the extension of special autonomy. So I hope to see you there, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Vero. Thanks for your commitment and your indefatigable fight for Victor and for other victims of human rights abuses in West Papua. I just want to show just going to show a brief extract from a recorded interview I did with Norman Voss from the International Coalition for Papua several nights ago. He's not able to join us online because it was the middle of the night in Germany. But I just want to show the last bit of the interview with him. And when our webpage is up and running, I'll put the entire interview there for you to watch. All right, well, I'm speaking to Mr. Norman Voss from the International Coalition for Papua. He has agreed to talk to us via Zoom since it would be approximately 2 a.m. His time during the conference time, and he has a very busy schedule on either side, either day. So he's generously agreed to do a pre-interview for us. Thank you, Norman.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so first, could I ask you, and are these and are you anticipating the killings over the next months because of the increase of security forces? Sorry?
It's lawlessness. It's just a war state in that bubble.
Yeah, the army is operating with complete impunity, which we've heard has been happening for.
I think that is clearly a case of political detention and arrest. The charges are not only treason. Last week, I think it was, the well-known human rights activist and advocate Victor Yemo, who works also with a lot of independence-focused groups around West Papua and organises protests, has been arrested and charged with treason and with inciting many of the protests that occurred around West Papua last year. What do you think about these charges of treason? I mean, is he in your view a political prisoner? And how do you think he'll be treated in prison while he's held there? I think that is clearly a case of political detention and arrest. The charges are not only treason, there are charges on incitement to violence, on conspiracy, arson, theft, collective violence. The emergency laws use not only the penal code, illegal possession of weapons, a super long list of charges.
They've hit him with the whole book.
Almost, so that could result in decades of imprisonment, depending on how it goes. But it also shows that there's a certain arbitrariness in the way these people are being charged with crimes, how they are arrested.
Victor Yaimo was a spokesperson of the KNPB, which is a politically active group. They're advocating their political vision on what should happen in Papua, which is their right to do. And he was also running this movement, to my understanding, against this Otsus II plan about the autonomy law revision. So this is advocacy in relation to how the political future would be looking like. So this is, he was effectively engaging on the right to self-determination, which is according to Article 1 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and Article 1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, a human right. So he was engaging on that right. In principle, Indonesia also recognizes that right, but not to the extent where it amounts to calling for independence. Nevertheless, the international legal standard is that it's a human right. He was engaged in that. On 9th of May, he was arrested. Local lawyers, when he was brought to Polda, I think LBH Papua, Legal Aid Foundation Papua, was supporting him. He has international support from Veronica Coleman, an excellent lawyer who is supporting political activists and their political freedom. He was brought to Brimob the day after, on 10th of May, and since then, many of these rights that you are entitled to in Indonesian law were denied, including that lawyers were having free access to him, that he was not allowed to contact his family members. His family members were not able to visit him. He was not given support and access to contact a doctor. And typically when you're arrested in Papua and then brought not only to police, but particularly the mobile brigades, you can expect that there's a very high risk of torture, at least ill treatment that is applied. I think he could likely face what others have faced in such political detention scenarios that could range from solitary confinement. Relocation is something we've seen with a few other cases. Misbuk Wijanga was such a case. He was arrested in Wamena and then brought to Jakarta, which made it almost impossible for family members to see him, for lawyers to support the case. So I don't know whether they will relocate him to another place with that intention as well. And as I recall, the last high-level arrest of a KNPB leader with Marco Tabuni ended in his killing. Marco Tabuni was killed during the event of arrest. Don't want to come up with the whole case of that time now, but it is not uncommon that politically detained Papuans that are active face torture or killings during arrest. So that's what we actually have to admit is a chance. We should give any support we have to his lawyers. And he should be released because the arrests of criminals need to take place. But here we have violations of criminal procedure law, violations of the rights of the detainee. So this is already from this point on no longer any fair criminal case.
Right. So a lot of West Papuans and countries around the world are now joining West Papuans and calling for a United Nations-led human rights investigation or fact-finding mission into West Papua to look at cases such as Victor's perhaps, but to look at many of the cases that you've outlined today and many more that are on the record. Indonesia has yet to set a date or to agree for such a fact-finding mission to take place. What should the United Nations be doing in the International Coalition for Papua's view?
Well, I think particularly now in the context of this terrorism label against the OPM and what was formerly known as criminal armed groups and so on, I think we can expect much more widespread arbitrary arrests. I expect an increase in violence, an increase of stigmatization of the general Papuan public. It is much easier than in the past to just arrest somebody because you can just point at them and say, we have a terrorist suspicion, we apply the terrorist law and not just the criminal procedure code here. So in this context, you need independent observance, you need monitoring. The UN has to, and that has been in the discussion for years, but delayed and delayed from the Indonesian side, the UN has to be given access to do the general monitoring work that they're doing in other parts of Indonesia, that they're doing in other countries. And I expect from Indonesia to cooperate with these UN mechanisms as other countries do. So that High Commissioner, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, should be given access to enter Papua, to monitor, to move freely, to look at what's going on and to verify the data. This is, to my understanding, what Papuans have been calling for many years, an independent verification. So I think they have a case here of they're not trying to cover something up, but trying to expose what's going on. And it's unfortunately the Indonesian side that is, to my understanding, obstructing this process. So such observers, UN have to visit, they have to report, they have to assess what's going on, and they have to contribute to working towards a solution, to a sustainable solution, so that these killings end.
Thank you so much.
For about half an hour. So we will have that up on our webpage, which we hope to have up soon. And you can watch the whole interview there. Now, just to close this morning/afternoon seminar, as Norman has just said, 180 countries, and an earlier speaker said that as well. There've been 180, I think it was Siobhan, 180 countries from around the world have joined with West Papuans in calling for an internationally, for a UN-led fact-finding mission into West Papua. What we hope that this seminar today can do is provide a body of evidence, a body of analysis that once up on the webpage, analysts and advocates can use to help push for this human rights fact-finding mission to take place. That's what we hope the West Papua project can be useful for, to help inform the advocacy that is happening around the world. Now, what I want you to think about as we close up today is what connections has this seminar and this Zoom and in-person event, what connections can come out of this? Can we strengthen connections that we already have with each other? Can we make new connections, new networks, and think of new ways to get together? Can we combine our strengths and our expertise, our interests and our friendships, and make them work in new ways to support West Papuans? I was thinking that this may or may not work. I have an Eventbrite list of everyone who has registered, and I might ask for an indication through Eventbrite of who is willing to have their names and their emails put on a list where we can continue this conversation later, because I realise that we have gone over time and so we don't have time for questions at this particular forum. But I will consult with you on Eventbrite after the weekend and see how we can kind of continue or make this more of a conversation, turn this seminar into a conversation between the participants and the speakers. I want to thank the experts who have shared their analyses today, who've been very generous with their time, who are very knowledgeable about the conflict in West Papua, and who have a heart for our neighbours who live, our closest neighbours to Australia. So thanks so much to each and every one of you who have shared today, both online and here in this room. And finally, just to close, I just want to honour Ronnie, the only West Papuan who's here today, but the West Papuan Sam, who has spoken, Leonie, Ori, Sam, and and any other West Papuan who is present on Zoom today to honour your struggle, because you guys are the ones that are living this. We're observing, we're supporting, but you're living this. And so let us know how we can better support you, how we can be better allies. West Papuans have been fighting this struggle for nearly 6 decades. So the West Papua Project is here as a vessel of advocacy and support. So I'll just finish on those words, and please feel free to join us. It's a pay your own way kind of deal. But for lunch, we'll probably just go to the Cafe Penitzis, I think it's called, that's across at the library. Thank you very much. Thank you.